Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer, paedophile, and child rapist who claimed to have killed 100 boys in a 12-month period between 1998 and 1999. He strangled his victims and then dissolved their bodies in acid. His self-proclaimed kill count makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and whilst there are some doubts about his number of victims, it's clear he ended the lives of many children and was proud of his crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Most sources state that Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, the second largest city in Pakistan, but other years of birth mentioned include 1961. He was the sixth of 8 children to his businessman father Muhammad, and the family, who observed the Muslim faith, was quite well off. Iqbal showed violent, self-entitled, and manipulative behaviour as a child, with one of his brothers stating, quote, "As a boy, he was violent and eccentric. He would give a lot of headache to our parents." Another brother said that if his parents ever refused his demands, he would threaten to hurt himself until he got what he wanted. Iqbal himself said that during his childhood, he first began having fancies about killing people. As a young man, Iqbal was described as arrogant, an individual consumed with his own self-importance, and he would regularly boast about his alleged ties to politicians and other famous people in Pakistan. He was desperate to give people the impression that he was part of high society and therefore better than them. Iqbal knew he was gay from a young age, something his conservative Muslim family refused to acknowledge, but it appears that this was a well-known secret. Iqbal's feelings of rejection and anger about not being able to openly indulge his sexual interest in males built up inside of him, and his resentment against society began to fester. Iqbal did marry twice in his life, even having a daughter, but it appears that these marriages were to stop rumours about his behaviour from spreading. However, when he got to his 20s, it became clear that Iqbal was not interested in men, but little boys, and he would go to great lengths in order to find victims. This was a time well before the internet, and people used adverts in magazines and newspapers in order to find people to speak to find pen pals, and Iqbal was one of these individuals. He put adverts in the Altair magazine, specifically stating he wanted to talk to people. It's not clear what his adverts specifically said, but it was like they were geared towards ensuring that the majority of those writing to him were children. I believe on one occasion, he said he wanted someone to write to about collecting stamps. Those children who did write to him would receive letters written in colourful pens, clearly to make them more attractive to a child. Iqbal would send money to the children in his letters in exchange for photographs of them, but also asking them to meet him. Whilst it was only a small amount of money, it was likely more than these children had ever seen, and many of them went to his property unaccompanied and were molested by Iqbal. In the neighbourhood where he lived, he quickly gained a reputation as a paedophile, and parents would keep their children as far away from him as possible, but this did not stop Iqbal from luring children from outside of the immediate area. A man who lived in the area said, quote, "It was an open secret. Everyone knew he molested young boys." Iqbal's family received numerous complaints about his paedophilia, but they were able to pay the families off. This seems to have emboldened Iqbal, and he became more brazen. In 1990, he lured a 9-year-old boy off the streets into his home and raped him. The boy's parents called the police and filed a report. He was arrested for sodomy. However, Iqbal was able to pay the police off, and the charge was dropped. Iqbal then opened an arcade in the early 1990s, which was a magnet for local children. He would spoil them, and an adult who used to go there as a child later stated, quote, "He spent lavishly on kids. He would buy us firecrackers. He even built fish aquariums and enclosures for snakes for the entertainment of neighbourhood kids." Children would flock to the arcade day and night, and Iqbal took full advantage of his constant stream of victims. He would drop a 100 rupee note on the floor, which is just under £1 or just over $1 in today's money. He would then watch which child picked it up and announce that his money had been stolen. He would then say he needed to search the boys. Once the money had been found on the boy who picked it up, he would be accused of being a thief and told to go with Iqbal into a different room, assumedly for punishment or a talking to. In this room, the boy would be anally raped and often told they could keep the money to buy their silence. Iqbal did this repeatedly. Eventually, word spread amongst the area and parents stopped letting their children go to the arcade. However, Iqbal was undeterred and set up an aquarium, a gym, and even a school, all with the intention of attracting young boys that he could molest. It's clear that Iqbal was a committed paedophile who would use family money to set up ventures to indulge his deviant sexual interest in little boys. Things got worse in 1993 when his father died and Iqbal received a significant amount of inheritance money. Iqbal would spend lavishly, including building a large house in Rana town in 1995, where he would often be seen with young boys who would invite over and no doubt molest. Eventually, Iqbal opened another arcade in order to continue to gain access to young boys and to rape them. In February 1998, a report was received from the police. They'd lured 2 young boys from the Das Darbar shrine in Lahore, taken them to a remote location, and raped them at gunpoint. Iqbal was again able to pay the police off and was not charged. On another occasion, Iqbal raped a child from an upper-class family. The matter was taken to the elders of the area, and Iqbal was forced to write a letter saying he wouldn't do it again. And this note was circulated around the area, and Iqbal was made to visit about 100 local businesses to apologise as penance for his crimes. However, his luck ran out in September 1998 when Iqbal was beaten severely by 2 children, including one who worked at the arcade. Iqbal was beaten so badly that he received severe head injuries and was unconscious for 22 days at Lahore General Hospital. Whilst he was unconscious, a child's family made a complaint of rape to the police, and, due to not being around to try and bribe his way out of it, when he regained consciousness, he was arrested on a charge of sodomy, but bailed. None of Iqbal's family were willing to pay for his medical treatment, so he had to pay for this out of his own pocket, and he lost his expensive house and cars and was essentially penniless. When he was released from hospital, he had weeks of recovery ahead and was unable to walk properly without assistance. He was forced to move into a run-down property in a slum near the Ravi Road in Lahore, and his aging mother took care of him. I found no real information about his mother, but she and Iqbal were apparently close, but she soon died of a heart attack, and Iqbal linked this directly to the stress of the police daring to arrest him for raping children. The death of his mother appears to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, and Javed Iqbal decided to get revenge against society by killing 100 male children. He wanted revenge against the police, who would dare to arrest him for raping children, and so would show how cunning he was by committing murders right under their noses. He wanted children to be punished because they dared to report his behaviour to the police and also attacked him, despite it being highly likely that those who assaulted him were children he had raped or attempted to rape. However, most of all, he wanted revenge for his mother's death, with him later confessing after his arrest, quote, "My mother cried for me. I wanted 100 mothers to cry for their children." Between approximately December 1998 and December 1999, Javed Iqbal put his sickening plan into action. Javed Iqbal showed a high level of planning in order to commit the murders. He'd apparently continued to fixate on murder throughout his adulthood and had mentioned to others that he felt he could commit the perfect murder by dissolving the bodies of his victims in acid. So Iqbal bought a number of barrels of hydrochloric acid and stored them in his home, which would also be the place where the children would be murdered. Iqbal also had accomplices. He shared his home with 3 boys, Sajid Ahmad, age 17, Mamad Nadeem, age 15, and Mamad Sabir, aged just 13 years old. There was also a 4th accomplice called Muhammad Ishaq, but I cannot find any information on him. These boys were so-called street children, those who were orphaned and had no family, or those whose family were extremely impoverished, so their children would take to the streets to try and make money any way they could. This included selling items on the streets, but a terrible profession that some of these, often very young children, were forced into was giving massages to men, which would inevitably end with sexual contact. Iqbal offered his accomplices money to bring in boys, which enabled them to be able to avoid this type of life, but only by victimizing others. The victims came from this same marginalized and often forgotten part of the population, and, using his accomplices' local knowledge, it was not difficult to find a steady stream of vulnerable children who were lured to Iqbal's apartment. Many of the victims were targeted at the Hira Mandi Bazaar and the Data Darbar Shrine, both in Lahore. The children would be lured to Iqbal's property, and, when inside, he would rape them, strangle them with a chain, and then dismember them, with the piece of their body then being dissolved in vats of acid. The remnants of these bodies would then be dumped, likely by being poured down a drain. The youngest victim was 6 years old, the oldest, 16. Iqbal would take the children's clothes and shoes and label them, often using a photo he had taken of the children just prior to his murder. This was his collection of trophies. I've struggled to find information on Iqbal's victims, but I have found information about 2 brothers, although the name of only one is mentioned, and neither's age is documented. One of these brothers escaped with his life, the other tragically did not, and their story gives an idea of how the gang operated to lure children into Iqbal's clutches. In October 1999, Ijaz Muhammad, lovingly known as Kaka by his family, and his older brother went out to try and make money. They were both masseurs and would walk the streets hanging out in parks, clinking together bottles of ointment in the hopes of attracting customers which, as already outlined, would usually be paedophilic men. Kaka's brothers said they were in the park in Lahore when they were approached by 2 boys not much older than them. They told them, quote, "Our boss needs a massage and he'll pay you double the price if you come with us." The brothers followed the pair until they were outside Iqbal's property. Kaka was told to go inside as the boss, Iqbal, was waiting to speak to him. Kaka's brother then left to try and find other customers. Kaka was never seen alive again. How many children Iqbal actually killed is disputed, and I'll return to this later, but regardless of the true number, it's clear that he was a prolific child murderer, and none of his crimes were noticed until he himself confessed, which he actually had to do twice before anyone actually bothered to do anything about it. In November 1999, a letter was received by Lahore police station, which was a confession, with the author stating they had killed 100 boys. A few officers went to the address on the note, Iqbal's home, and knocked on the door. When he answered, he was agitated and abusive, and at one point, pulled out a gun and began threatening the officers, saying he would shoot himself if they didn't leave him alone. So, what did they do in this situation? Did they bundle him to the floor, arrest him, and search the property? No, they simply walked away. In December 1999, Javed Iqbal mailed the same letter, along with dozens of pictures of boys he'd murdered, to the offices of Jang, Pakistan's most popular Urdu language newspaper. This landed on the desk of the editor, Jamal Chisti, who later stated, quote, "After going through the contents of the envelope, I thought there could be 2 possibilities. Either someone was trying to frame him, or this man has really done it." Jamil and a colleague took it upon themselves to investigate, and they, like the police a month before, went to Iqbal's property. It was abandoned and padlocked. The 2 journalists scaled an outside wall in order to gain entry. What they found inside was like something out of a nightmare. They saw bloodstains all over the floor and walls, and noticed blood on a chain, the same one used to strangle the victims. There were sacks scattered around the floor, as well as a journal, with placards neatly pinned to the wall explaining what they'd found like some sick museum exhibit. One placard read, quote, "The 5 sacks lying in one corner of this room contain the clothes of 100 victims, while the remaining 3 contain 85 pairs of shoes belonging to them. All details of the murders are contained in the diary and the 32-page notebook that had been placed in the room. This is my confessional statement." Another read, quote, "I've decided to commit suicide." There was a distinct smell of decomposition, which seemed to be emanating from 2 barrels in the property. One of these was opened and found to contain human body parts which had been dissolved. Later it would be determined that the barrels contained a human torso, as well as 2 feet amputated at the ankle. They were determined to be the remains of 3 different children who had been dead for some time. A placard on the wall near the barrels stated, quote, "The bodies in this room have deliberately not been disposed of, so that the authorities will find them after my suicide." Also found in the property were bags and bags of human hair, clearly taken from the heads of the victims due to how long this would take to dissolve in acid. This point, and the whole setup, indicates that Iqbal had set up a production line of murder and dismemberment, with him having researched every aspect of how to achieve his horrific objective of killing 100 boys as quickly as possible. It appears that he achieved this in approximately 12 months. Jamil and his colleague began investigating what they'd found. Using the notebook they recovered, they were able to contact the families of children Iqbal had claimed to have murdered, and they were able to establish that these children had indeed disappeared. On December the 3rd, 1999, the story was published on the front page under the headline, quote, "Claim of murder of 100 kids," with 57 pictures of the murdered children being published on the front page, many of them smiling, not knowing about their impending horrific fate. Publication of this story caused understandable chaos, and parents of missing children descended on the area, clutching photographs of their babies. Then, and only then, did the police actually do anything. They recovered the barrels from the property and sent them off for examination. They also collected all the shoes and clothing and laid them out in an evidence room, whilst grieving parents had to pore through these piles, looking for items belonging to their children. Absolutely horrific. The police then began looking for Iqbal and his accomplices. His 4 accomplices were found first, having been arrested when they tried to cash a stolen traveller's check. However, whilst in custody, one of these, Mohammed Ishaq, apparently committed suicide by jumping out of a window whilst being questioned. From what I've read, suspects of particularly heinous crimes having accidents or committing suicide were quite common in this part of the world at this time, and was a poor attempt at a cover-up when these people were murdered or assisted out of the window by being thrown. Iqbal was nowhere to be found, but the police didn't have to look for him for long. On the 30th of December 1999, Javed Iqbal walked into the newspaper office of Jang and gave himself up. At the time, legal proceedings in Pakistan were usually held behind closed doors, but the court case against Javed Iqbal and his accomplices was widely covered by the cameras. Despite his confession, it's clear that Iqbal wanted things on his terms. He wanted attention and praise for what he'd done, but he didn't want to suffer the consequences of his actions, and so, despite writing a 30-plus page confession and leaving signs above all of the evidence, he claimed he was innocent of the offences. His claims were laughable. On one occasion, he said his confession about killing 100 boys was simply to bring attention to the plight of Pakistan's impoverished child population. Seriously? I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one. He also claimed that despite the remains found in the barrels in his home being identified as human bodies, the dismembered remains of children, he claimed they were simply full of beef and other meat as a way to confuse the police. Iqbal made long, rambling statements in court, which made little sense, including him saying, quote, "I was considered an insane person, but I beg that my viewpoint must also be heard. I considered myself a culprit because I have been made a culprit by police. So I think what he's saying here is that he confessed the crimes because the police told him he was the one responsible. Right." Inevitably, Iqbal and his accomplices were found guilty, and on March 16, 2000, stood to be sentenced before Judge Ranja. 13-year-old Mahmoud Sabir was sentenced to 63 years in prison. 15-year-old Mahmoud Nadeem was sentenced to 182 years in prison. 17-year-old Sajid Ahmad was sentenced to death by hanging. As for Javed Iqbal, he was sentenced to death and then some. The judge ordered that he be strangled publicly in the street in front of the families of his victims. His body would then be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid, exactly the way he had murdered so many children. However, despite this sentence being, in my opinion, quite fitting, it quickly caused an uproar amongst human rights activists and was appealed. It was determined that this sentence was abhorrent and could not be carried out. So, a new sentence date was set for the middle of October 2001, but Javed Iqbal would never attend this. On October the 9th, 2001, both individuals sentenced to death, Javed Iqbal and Sajid Ahmad, were found dead in their respective cells in prison. The official report was that they died by poisoning themselves. However, autopsies of both found they had clear signs of strangulation and a pattern of injuries suggesting they'd both been beaten at the time of their deaths and in the weeks and months before. I think it's pretty clear that the prison guards or prisoners, or both, took matters into their own hands with this one, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. Before talking about the profile of Javed Iqbal, an important issue is why he was able to get away with this for so long. Iqbal's crimes only came to light when he confessed. He claimed that he could have killed 500 if he wanted to. I think this is true. The police just didn't care. Why is that? Central to this is the inefficiency and corruption in the police, which had an impact on them actually bothering to investigate anything, with the parents of the murdered children even feeling they were able to report their loved ones missing. The reason for this, from my research, was the rampant corruption and extortion happening in the police. Victims' families were scared to go to the authorities, for fear they would be shaken down and what little they had taken from them. They also knew that nothing would be done. As they came from poor families, their problems simply didn't matter. This is why only 25 of the 100 children who went missing were ever reported to the police. This is absolutely disgusting, and I pray that the police in Pakistan have changed significantly in the 20+ years since this horrific case. Before getting to Javed Iqbal's psychology, I want to play a very, very short clip of one of his ramblings, which I think was made to a journalist during an interview.
ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा फांसी खुदा तो मेरी हस्ती को भी नबूस कर देता अगर खुदा एक आदमी, दो आदमी, 3 आदमी, 10 आदमी, 15 आदमी, 20 आदमी खुदा का था।
Getting tired of the number of cases I've come across where religion is brought into it. It's either the devil made me do it, or God commanded me to do it. Or, in this case, well, if I was doing anything wrong, God would have stopped me. These are all examples of distancing language, shifting the responsibility of what they have done to someone or something else, allowing them to continue to diminish responsibility for their actions. It's clear that by the time that he appeared in court, Iqbal was panicking. I think he was so disconnected from reality that he believed he was justified in what he was doing, and that, when he announced his killing spree, people would fall in a pile on the floor, worship him as a god, and he would walk through the streets feared. He'd stuck his middle finger up at society, and he expected society to simply back down, having learnt their lesson, don't mess with Javed Iqbal, and then continued on his merry way, like he's continuing to rape and murder children. I imagine he had fancies of newspaper interviews, television appearances, where the focus would be on him and his accomplishments, with people fascinated by his genius and the fact that he'd fought back against oppression. That is the only reason why he confessed, to get this recognition, and why he contacted the media and surrendered himself to them. However, when reality hit home and he realised, hey, people are pretty pissed, he scrambled around looking for some way to wriggle out of this airtight coffin he created for himself. And this included claiming that he'd faked everything to send some sort of powerful message to raise awareness about the plight of impoverished children. That one I find particularly pathetic. Iqbal's mindset and his offending shows profound narcissism and psychopathic personality. He genuinely appeared to think that he was above everyone else and that he should be allowed to rape as many children as he wanted. How dare the police try to stop him? If they arrested him, it was not because he had violated the bodies and minds of these children. It was because no one recognised the genius of him. These children were merely objects for him to use and abuse, to gain sexual gratification, but then to murder in order to get its own back at society that had tried to stop his sick sexual behaviour. How many children Javed Iqbal killed is unclear. It seems as though some of the children he claimed to have murdered were later found safe and well, but this only accounted for around 4 or 5 of them. Also, around 20 to 30 of the victims have never been identified from their photos, which is heartbreaking, as these were likely children who had no one, and so, when they died, there was no one to even notice or search for them. However, around 70 of the children in the pictures were identified, and they have never returned home. So the actual total is likely to be somewhere between 70 to 90 plus, which is just a staggering and horrific total, which makes Javed Iqbal one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. As with other men who consider themselves to be superior, akin to gods, Javed Iqbal was a coward who targeted the most vulnerable in society. I'm not advocating for death to anyone, but I for one do not mourn his passing or have particular negative emotions about the manner of his death. Gary Heidnik was an American double murderer, a serial rapist with a hatred of women, who, over a 4-month period between 1986 and 1987, abducted 6 women off the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and held them captive in the basement of his home. He beat, tortured, and raped his captives, and whilst 4 of them miraculously survived, 2 were murdered, and one of these was dismembered. Heidnik was one of the inspirations for the character Buffalo Bill from the film Silence of the Lambs. But when you hear his story, I've no doubt you'll think he's a man far worse than any movie villain, and what he put these women through was worse than any horror movie, and like something out of a nightmare. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November the 22nd, 1943, in the Cleveland suburb of Eastlake in Ohio, to Michael and Ellen. He also had a younger brother, Trevor. Whilst Michael stated the boys were raised in a loving household, it appears it was anything but. Trevor later reported that Michael was extremely violent towards all members of the family and would beat his sons and his wife. Trevor said in an interview in 1987, quote, "Got to the point where we'd be afraid to pick anything up because he'd beat us if we dropped something like a glass or something. I was knocked unconscious once." When Heidnik was 3 years old, his parents separated and the boys went to live with their mother. However, this environment was also no place for a child, with their mother having issues with alcohol. She would often leave the children alone while she went out drinking, bringing home different men most nights. After 4 years, the boys were returned to the care of their father and his new wife, as his mother could no longer take care of them. So both of them went out of the frying pan and back into the fire, and Heidnik reported persistent emotional and psychological abuse by his father. Heidnik was a chronic bedwetter, with his father humiliating him whenever this happened, by making him hang the urine-soaked sheets out the window in full view of the neighbours. Also, it's reported that Heidnik and his brother were forced to wear trousers with, I assume, fabric bullseyes sewn onto them, which children at school would kick. This compounded the abuse that Heidnik already suffered, due to him receiving a serious injury to his head when he was 6 years old, which left it misshapen after he fell out of a tree. In addition, Michael had particularly discriminatory attitudes and beliefs regarding African Americans, and instilled in his sons his racist views that these individuals were lesser forms of life due to the colour of their skin. Heidnik was a morose and solitary child. He made no effort to engage with other children and appeared very aloof. On one occasion, Heidnik was approached by a female student who asked him if he'd done his homework, to which Heidnik responded by shouting at her, saying she was, quote, "not worthy to speak to him." Heidnik excelled academically and was reported to have an IQ of 148, which would put him in the exceptionally gifted category. However, he had no direction in life and seemed rudderless, with him flitting from one potential profession to another. This began at the age of 14 years old, when Heidnik enrolled at Staunton Military Academy in Staunton, Virginia, but dropped out 2 years later before graduating. He then returned to school, but then dropped out at the age of 17 and joined the United States Army. It appeared that, by this point, Heidnik had developed 2 obsessions: becoming an army officer and making money. Heidnik was described as an excellent recruit, but following basic training, he was rejected from several specialist positions. This included in the military police and instead he trained as an army medic in San Antonio, Texas, and, as a side hustle, he lent money to fellow soldiers and charged them interest on these loans. Heidnik was then transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. However, things began to fall apart for Gary Heidnik in late August 1962, at the age of 19, when he went to the sick bay, complaining of dizziness, blurred vision, and nausea. It's also noted that Heidnik began showing signs of mental illness, and although it's not clear what he was suffering from, given the fact he was prescribed antipsychotics, it's likely he was showing signs of schizophrenia, which potentially included him experiencing delusions and hallucinations. However, there are some who believe that he faked this diagnosis to get a discharge from the army. However, it should be noted that mental illness does appear to have been a common factor in Heidnik's family, with his brother Trevor spending time in mental institutions and attempting suicide multiple times during his life. And in 1970, Ellen, his mother, committed suicide by poisoning herself. With regards to Heidnik, he would be admitted to psychiatric hospitals no less than 20 times between 1962 and 1987 due to repeated suicide attempts. In October 1962, Heidnik was transferred to a military hospital in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. This is a condition characterized by someone who chooses to be alone and chooses to pursue solitary habits, whilst having little or no desire to interact with others outside of necessary interactions. They also have difficulty expressing emotions and reacting appropriately to situations, and they're often outwardly humorless, emotionally detached, and cold to others. It appears, due to this diagnosis, Heidnik was honourably discharged from the army and given a disability allowance. Heidnik had served a grand total of 13 months serving his country. Shortly after his discharge, he became a licensed practical nurse and enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, only to drop out a single semester later. He worked at a VA hospital in Coatesville, but was fired for poor attendance and rude behaviour towards patients, with him showing no empathy towards them and being aggressive generally towards staff and patients. It appears that despite his high intellect, Heidnik was unable to hold down a job or actually pursue a career, and he appears to have been quite entitled. It seems like he wanted to be handed professions on a plate, but when he found out this wouldn't happen immediately and would require some work, he would leave. So, with the army, when he realised he wasn't going to be promoted to a 4-star general by a week on Thursday, he got bored and wandered off. It's important to note the types of jobs or careers Heidnik was pursuing, with them all being ones where someone has power over another, whether this be an officer in the armed forces, a police officer, or a nurse. In October 1971, Heidnik set up a church called, quote, the United Church of the Ministers of God. Initially, the church had just 5 members. In 1975, he opened an account under the church's name with Merrill Lynch. The initial deposit was $1,500, but through shrewd investment, within 10 years Heidnik had turned this into $500,000, and the church eventually grew to 50 devoted followers, led by the self-anointed Bishop Gary Heidnik. It appears this church was, in part, set up so that Heidnik could avoid paying taxes, but I think it served another purpose. It gave Heidnik a captive audience. It gave him people that would hang on his every word, and gave him the sense of power he'd been attempting to find throughout his life up until this point. As his church gave him money and sense of power, Heidnik stuck with it. It was still active at the time of his arrest in 1987, with then contacting investigators to ask whether Bishop Heidnik would soon be released to lead the congregation. Some authors say that Heidnik's ultimate intention was to turn his church into a cult, and I wouldn't be surprised, as it's clear he was a man who wanted power and others doing exactly what he said, following his every command without question. However, whilst Heidnik professed to speak the word of God, his behaviour towards others was anything but holy. It appears that Gary Heidnik's first serious brush with the law was in 1976, when, after a disagreement with the tenant at a house he was renting, he fired a gun at him, with the bullet grazing his face. It's reported that in the 1970s, Heidnik would begin relationships with African-American women, with him telling others that these women, quote, treated him better than whites ever did. However, he would also specifically pick women with severe learning disabilities. This, I think, is a combination of Heidnik's racist beliefs, his narcissism, and further evidence of him wanting to place himself in positions where he controlled people. Due to his childhood, it appears that Heidnik considered African Americans to be inferior and therefore less of a threat to him. When you also add in the disability aspect, in his mind, Heidnik likely felt there was a massive power disparity in these relationships, with him being totally in control of them, being able to use and abuse his partners at will. One such woman was called Anjanette Davidson, who had significant learning disabilities. Anjanette had a sister, Alberta, who lived in a mental health institute. Alberta was a 34-year-old woman who had the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. One day in 1978, Heidnik signed Alberta out of the institution, apparently on day release. He then took her back to his property and kept her chained up in the basement. Over the next 9 days, he repeatedly raped and sodomized Alberta. Where she didn't return, the institution called the police and a search was conducted of Heidnik's property, but nothing was found, and he bought time by claiming that he put her back on a bus home. When a second search was conducted, Alberta was found confined in a small storeroom in the basement. After Alberta was medically examined, she was found to have clear signs of sexual assault, including tears in her vagina. She had also contracted gonorrhea. Heidnik was subsequently charged with kidnapping, rape, forced imprisonment, unlawful restraint, and interfering with the custody of a committed person, amongst other offences. At his trial in November 1978, Heidnik pleaded not guilty, and heartbreakingly, Alberta, due to her cognitive difficulties, was deemed unfit to testify. So, as opposed to a list of charges which would have placed Gary Heidnik behind bars forever, many of the most serious charges had to be dropped. He was eventually only convicted of unlawful restraint, interfering with the custody of a committed person, and recklessly endangering another person. Psychiatrists who assessed Heidnik indicates he showed no remorse for his actions and was extremely likely to commit similar or worse offences in the future. Heidnik was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in the state penitentiary, eventually serving 4 and being released on March 24, 1983. It isn't clear whether Heidnik's initial thinking around targeting mentally disabled women included the fact that, if he was caught, he could simply plead not guilty and they would not be able to testify against him. I think this is likely. However, even if this wasn't the case, he now had an example of the power of this strategy, with him likely thinking, yeah, I went to prison, but I served 4 rather than 24 years. I've no doubt that Heidnik was looking for loopholes and ways to avoid detection and punishment, whilst planning and fantasizing about his ultimate goal, to have control over completely subservient women who would be his personal sex slaves. Soon after his release from prison, Heidnik began using a matrimonial service and began to communicate with a woman called Betty Disto in the Philippines. In September 1985, she flew over to the US and married Heidnik in Maryland on the 3rd of October 1985. No doubt Heidnik thought that she, due to her ethnic origin, would be subservient and easy to control. He was wrong. Betty would frequently voice her concerns and hold her husband accountable for his appalling behaviour, which included him forcing her to watch whilst he had sex with other women. During their brief marriage, Betty was raped and beaten repeatedly, and it was only with the help of the Filipino community in Philadelphia that she was able to escape the marriage in January 1986. Soon afterwards, Heidnik was arrested for assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, but all charges were dropped when Betty, like Hufir, did not attend the court case. At this point, I imagine the wheels in Heidnik's twisted mind were turning, with him realising that if he wished to have a harem of women at his command, he needs to return to his original victim typology and replicate the behaviour which had given him some limited success before, specifically, in the case of Alberta, confining this woman in the basement. If he could find similar vulnerable women and bring them to his basement, he would have the on-demand sex slaves he was desperate to acquire. By November 1986, Heidnik decided to put his horrific plan into action. In total, Gary Heidnik abducted 6 women from the streets of Philadelphia, with the first being 25-year-old Josephina Rivera, who, on November the 25th, 1986, was working as a prostitute in order to support her family. she was picked up by Heidnik in his white Cadillac, where he paid her for her services. After this, they went to McDonald's, where Heidnik bought Josephina some coffee. Josephina then agreed to a further trade of sex for money, but this time Heidnik wanted to do it at his home, to which she agreed. So Heidnik drove Josephina to 3520 North Marshall Street. Josephina later recalled being suspicious when she got to the home, noticing that in the front door was half a key, with Heidnik having the other half, and the door could only be opened when these two parts were held together. What Josephina didn't realise was that this was so that the keyhole could not be seen through, and the lock was essentially blocked, meaning it could only be opened from the outside. After having sex in the main bedroom, Josephina went to put her clothes back on, and Heidnik then grabbed her by the neck from behind and began to choke her. She begged him to stop, but instead, he handcuffed her wrists and pushed her down the stairs to the basement. Heidnik then got a shovel and began digging a hole in the floor of the basement, whilst telling the handcuffed Josephina that he was planning to capture 10 women whom he would force to get pregnant, and then they would raise his children. She was then pushed through the hole. She tried to escape but could not, and Heidnik left and didn't return for 27 hours. But when he didn't return alone. Sandra Lindsay was also 25 years old, and she was extremely vulnerable and was a patient at a care facility called the Elwyn Institute. Sandra was already known to Heidnik, as he'd previously raped her in the facility where she was staying, and she'd fallen pregnant, but had an abortion. On November the 26th, 1986, Heidnik took Sandra from the Elwyn Institute and brought her back to his home. Heidnik told Sandra to write a letter to her mother, saying she'd left the institute and that she was fine. He then went to New York and posted this letter. However, Sandra's mother did not believe the contents and went to the police. She must have known about Heidnik, as she gave the police his address and said her daughter was likely being held there. Tragically, the police did nothing, assuming Sandra was just another runaway. On the first night that both women were together, they were viciously raped and beaten by Heidnik, and this pattern continued each and every day. They were kept naked and had to huddle together for warmth in the unheated basement. They slowly began to fall ill due to hypothermia, starvation, and dehydration. On the 22nd of December 1986, 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was walking to a friend's house when Heidnik pulled up alongside her and asked if she was working the streets. Lisa was not a prostitute and was offended. Heidnik said he would take her wherever she wanted as a way to apologise. Eventually, the pair ended up going to dinner and then back to his house, where he drugged her wine, and Lisa soon fell unconscious. She awoke to Heidnik dragging her to the bedroom, where he raped her. He then handcuffed her and threw her in the pit in the basement. On the 2nd of January 1987, Heidnik abducted 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. It's not known how he came across her, but it appears that she was potentially homeless at the time. Deborah fought every step of the way, and Heidnik had trouble subduing her and placing her in the hole. She was viciously beaten and eventually took her place with the other captives. 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins was a sex worker who Heidnik picked up on the 18th of January 1987. After agreeing to money for sex, Jacqueline went to Heidnik's home and, after having sex, he strangled her, cuffed her, and forced her into the hole. So by the 18th of January 1987, there were 5 women chained up in Gary Heidnik's basement. By this point, the first woman he abducted, Josephina Rivera, had been living this nightmare for 52 days. Heidnik would rape and beat the women without mercy. He'd also try to divide and conquer them, with him assigning one as the leader when he went out. And when he got back, he would ask the leader which of the women had misbehaved. If no one was singled out, they would all be beaten. No doubt in order to heighten their terror, Heidnik would shove sharp objects into the women's ears in an attempt to deafen them so they could not hear him coming, but also so they didn't know when he'd left so they couldn't try to escape. Heidnik would feed the women as and when he pleased, and his erratic behaviour appeared to dictate how often they would be fed and what they would receive. On some days they'd get nothing, on other days they might get dog food, but on one occasion to celebrate one of the captive women's birthdays, he provided them with Chinese food and champagne. However, the women were malnourished, dehydrated, suffering from hypothermia, battered, bruised, and in considerable pain, with several of them becoming seriously unwell, especially Sandra Lindsay. In February 1987, Sandra angered Heidnik by trying to remove the planks of wood that sat over the hole in the basement. In response, he handcuffed one of Sandra's wrists to a beam in the ceiling and left her hanging there for days. Convinced she was pregnant with his child, Heidnik tried to force feed her in order to keep the child alive. But, in a weakened state, Sandra's body was beginning to give up. Eventually, she died, and when the handcuff was removed, she slumped to the floor. Josephina said when she saw Sandra was dead, quote, "I was broken-hearted. Me and Sandra were close. We spent so many hours together in the hole." Heidnik, the monster that he was, with cold efficiency, then sought to get rid of Sandra's body. He forced the other women to be involved in dissecting her body and used a power saw to remove her limbs, with him putting Sandra's legs and arms in the freezer, marking them as, quote, "dog food." Heidnik cooked her ribs in the oven and put Sandra's head on a stove to boil. Heidnik showed Deborah Dudley, who had fought him so hard when she was abducted, Sandra's head on the stove and warned her that she would end up the same way if she defied him. There's a rumour that Sandra's remains were ground up, mixed with dog food and fed to the other women, but this isn't backed up by the evidence. The putrid smell from cooking Sandra's body parts led to neighbours calling the police, and when they attended, Heidnik simply said that he burnt a roast, and they left. Whilst raping and torturing these women, Heidnik would occasionally leave the basement, go upstairs in his property, and hold sermons for his church congregation before returning to continue his vile abuse. Heidnik would also use electricity to torture the women, applying a live wire to their chains, giving them electric shocks. On March 19, 1987, Heidnik put 3 of the women, including Deborah Dudley, into a pit filled with water whilst they were wearing chains. He then applied mains current to their bindings, and, as a result of this, Deborah died. By this point, Josephina realized the only way she was going to survive was to pretend to be compliant, and she began to convince Heidnik that she was enjoying her time with him, and she was given more trust and more freedom. This included her assisting him in removing Deborah's body from the property and dumping her remains, and agreeing with him that they needed to abduct another woman in order to replace the 2 who had died. As a result of this, Heidnik would take Josephina out in his car in order to look for women to abduct. On the 23rd of March 1987, they came across 24-year-old Agnes Adams, who was known to both of them, as Heidnik had previously engaged in her services as a sex worker, and Josephina from when the pair had worked in a strip club together. She was taken back to the property, assaulted, and forced into the hole in the basement. This appeared to cement Heidnik's trust in Josephina, and on the 24th of March 1987, she asked if she could go visit family, and she promised to return with a new woman for his collection. Heidnik agreed and drove Josephina to a petrol station and said he would wait there while she went to see her relatives. Josephina then walked a short distance away and called the police. When they arrived, they saw the imprint of restraints on her leg and thankfully believed her. The police then drove to the petrol station and arrested Gary Heidnik. The police then went to Heidnik's property and opened the basement to release the surviving women. This stunning and horrific picture shows where the officers found when they peered into the hole. The police were able to recover the body of Deborah Dudley and were able to recover some of the body parts of Sandra Lindsay. This included removing her arms and legs from the freezer. They also found pieces of her thigh, skin, and muscle, all neatly wrapped. Over 27 pounds of dismembered human remains were recovered in total. To close this section, I want to play a short clip of Josephina Rivera talking about her experiences in around 2014.
Here with me now is Josephina Rivera. Thank you so much, Josephina. I've watched this. This is the first time that I've actually seen this, and I'm trying to hold back my tears.
Right.
So I can't even imagine
Right.
what you endured.
We endured a lot. We really endured a lot. I truly endured a lot, especially in the beginning, being the first one. I could just so remember just sleeping with handcuffs behind my back every night and chains on my ankles, and I would wake up and just think it was a dream, you know.
Or a nightmare, really.
A nightmare.
Right. During that time, what kept you going? What kept you alive throughout all the torture and the cruelty that you endured on a daily basis?
You know, through the strength of God, and I just said I'm going out of here the way I came in here. If I walked in here, I'm going to walk out of here.
So that was really that's what kept you focused
yes,
on that you're going to get at, that sense of determination.
Right.
What was the interaction between you and the other women?
It was really, really very difficult. I mean, we're in a situation where none of us know each other, and each one is dealing with different mental stability. And you know, I tried my best, being the first one down there, trying to calm everybody that came down. It didn't always work, you know, but, you know, you try to, you know, sit down and talk and try to keep them, you know, you ask them about their family and their kids and their life, and, you know, try to make it a little bit normalcy for them as much as possible, you know, and try to say, well, hey, you're going to be all right, you know, we're going to try to get out of here alive. And it was difficult at times. It was. When Sandra died, me and Sandra had been there from the beginning, so when Sandra died, it just really broke my heart, and it just really made me see the severity of Gary Heineck.
Did you think you were next after she died? Did you think that he was going to go after you?
Oh, at that point, it was like anything could happen. You know, it was like a day-by-day thing. It was just, each day was worse than the day before. You know, and it just never seemed like it was getting any better.
Did you ever think, Josephina, that you were going to get out of there? Did you ever plot it? Did you ever talk
I didn't plot it. I really didn't realize how much Gary Heineck actually liked me and how much I was getting through to him until the last few days. I knew I was going to get out of there one way or another. I mean, that was like my ultimate goal, was to make sure that I got out safely and he couldn't get to me and he couldn't get back to the other girls and get rid of them, you know. And so I don't know if there was a plan, but it worked out.
But a sense of survival that you
Yes.
had to keep yourself going throughout, no matter what.
Exactly,
That time.
and trying to deal with Heineck himself, and then trying to deal with the other girls, and trying to put something together. It was amazing.
Now you still have some injury from what he did with
Right,
your
this
ear.
year.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he found out that we could hear him underground coming in and out, his car pulling in and out of the driveway, because his basement sat underground and we could hear him walking through the house. So he decided to take screwdrivers and damage our eardrums with screwdrivers.
Did you?
To dent our ears so that we wouldn't be able to hear him coming in and out.
And you still have difficulty
Yeah.
hearing.
Oh yeah, everything I listen to is loud.
Now, you have children, and you were reunited with your children.
Yes, I
recently.
was.
How's
Ricky and Zornay, I put up for adoption right after the Heineck thing happened. At the time, the foster parents and Zornay and Ricky were very close, and they were in a loving home. I personally, mentally or physically, wasn't mentally capable of taking care of them. So my decision for them to allow them to adopt them was a good thing. Me and Notorious stayed in touch. She came back and lived with me when she was 12, and we stayed close.
Remember what I said about Gary Heineck having an almost genius level IQ before? Well, on the 23rd of April 1987, he walked into court and pleaded not guilty to all offences. His initial defence? The women were already there when he moved in. That's it. This later appears to have changed, him claiming he knew about the women, but they'd killed each other. Heineck also made claims of cannibalism, but this was not backed up by evidence when forensic analysis of cooking utensils was undertaken, and it appears this was likely part of an insanity defence. The question of mental illness was central to this case, but the brave testimony of the surviving victims showed how methodical and planned these offences were. In addition, it was pointed out that Heidnik was competent enough to make hundreds of thousands of dollars from investments and run a church for over 10 years. The jury didn't believe a word of it, and on the 1st of July 1988, Gary Heidnik was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 of aggravated assault, and 1 of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. He was then sentenced to death. Gary Heidnik spent over a decade on death row and never admitted any guilt or showed any remorse for his crimes. In January 1999, he tried to escape his date with the executioner by attempting to take an overdose, but this was unsuccessful. Before his execution, Heidnik reportedly claimed that he wanted to be executed because the execution of an innocent man would stop the death penalty in America. Just before 10 p.m. on Tuesday, July the 6th, 1999, after a last meal of 2 slices of pizza and black coffee, Gary Heidnik stepped to the death chamber at SCI Rockview and was strapped to the gurney. At 10:12 p.m., the execution began and the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 10:29 p.m. And when this occurred, one of the witnesses reportedly shouted, quote, "Thank you, Jesus." He made no final statement. Before talking about this monster, I want to play a short clip of him speaking during an interview after his incarceration. Look at this man's eyes. I, for one, find them terrifying.
How much verbal exchange did you have with the girls down there in the basement?
At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties there for one thing. I had a Christmas party and a New Year's party.
Heidnik told agents Douglas and Ray that he had a routine for the women he held captive in his basement.
8, they go down in the hole in the morning. Board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. Okay. Now, on this particular day...
Got a radio down here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Playing real loud?
Yes.
Why is that? To drown out any noise?
Right.
In case because you're leaving the house sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't
I was... You know, I'm not holding nothing back. I realize that's incriminating. That's incriminating for me to say that in a state of mind. I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment too, you know.
The radio didn't stop the women from screaming for help, so Gary Heidnik tried shocking them into silence with electricity.
You do say that you were electrocuted as punishment.
Yeah.
And you did that systematically for some time.
No. Only several days. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering so I could stop
progressive
hollering.
kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. I don't mean I hope so, but I mean, you know, that's what I was trying to achieve, you know, to make them behave.
After one of the victims died from torture, Heidnik told Douglas and Ray he didn't know what to do with the body.
I'm sitting there, you know, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know. What the to do, you know. I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I dismembered the body and I you know, started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
You're trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
The lack of remorse and delusion in this man is truly horrifying. Gary Heidnik is reported to have been one of the worst, most frightening killers the FBI agent John Douglas ever spoke to. He's the man whose career was the basis for the television series Mindhunter. Remember, he interviewed some of the most depraved and vicious killers of modern time, including Edward Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, and Ted Bundy. So for Heidnik to be at the top of this infamous list is really saying something. I would agree that this man's crimes are particularly heinous, but why did he do it? I think that due to his traumatic childhood, Heidnik developed a general hatred of society, but in particular women, likely due to the lack of care from his mother. Also, due to the racist use of his father, I believe that Heidnik considered those from any ethnic background, but particularly African Americans, as an even lesser form of life. Likely due to his intellect, Heidnik appears to have felt that he was special and worthy of great things, that others were not worthy of him. Given his gifts, I think that he assumed that people should just hand him power, and so he tried to integrate himself into society by applying for these types of positions. But, due to his own arrogance and his lack of any social skills, he was unable to obtain them, and also likely because he wasn't given what he wanted quickly enough. So, he took matters into his own hands, creating scenarios in his own life where he could feel ultimate power over people, reinforcing to himself how superior he was. This included him beginning relationships with women with intellectual disabilities, knowing they were no match for him intellectually. Whilst he likely felt very powerful in these situations, he was essentially an utter coward, a tiny little man who would rape and abuse, in some cases, women who had the mental age of children. Whilst there may have been a financial motivation to him setting up his church, I have no doubt he had aspirations of being a cult leader, having ultimate power over people, commanding their every move, using them any way he wanted, and ultimately ordering their suicide if he deemed it necessary. As he amassed his religious congregation, he also collected women, like objects, using them to get his sexual kicks, and no doubt getting off on the fact they were powerless, he could kill them at any moment. I think that Gary Heidnik considered himself a god and wanted mere mortals to fear him and acknowledge his superiority over them. What Heidnik was ultimately planning to do is anyone's guess. Perhaps he was going to breed a colony, create his own cult from the ground up. However, what I find so perfect about this case is that one of these African American women, who he considered so beneath him, outsmarted him, manipulated him into believing that she supported his lunacy, and she was eventually able to take him down and save the lives of others. On the 19th of September 2021, Derbyshire Police in the UK received the following horrific 999 call.
Basically, I need the police and the ambulance and that because I've killed 4 people.
Okay, just hold the line. Bear with me.
This was no joke. The man making this call, Damien Bendel, had in fact killed 4 people, including his pregnant partner, her 2 children, and another child who was at the property for a sleepover. He also raped one of the children while they lay dying. This crime shocked the nation and led to a review which revealed serious failings in the management of this man's case by people who should have been protecting the public. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Damien Bendel was born on the 6th of January 1990 and raised in the town of Swindon in Wiltshire. I don't have much information about his upbringing, but it appears he grew up in a dysfunctional family, surrounded by domestic abuse, drugs, and general criminality. Bendel would wear his family's reputation with pride, with him often boasting about how often his family members had been in jail. He was described by people in the local area as someone who thought he was a, quote, bad boy, and, quote, wannabe gangster, who was desperate to emulate his family members, who he idolised. He engaged in a campaign of antisocial behaviour in his local area, terrorising neighbours and shop owners, as well as committing petty crimes such as shoplifting. A massive red flag was the fact that Bendel was known in the area as someone who enjoyed torturing animals, and he would boast about killing kittens and dogs by beating them to death with bricks. Clearly, from a young age, Bendel was an individual who believed he could do and take whatever he wanted without consequence. An individual who enjoyed violence and inflicting pain on others, someone who was willing to violently kill living creatures. He was also a racist and would racially abuse and target Asian members of the community. He claimed to have been a high-ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, but, whilst he was undoubtedly a white supremacist, his affiliations to any right-wing organisation has never been proven. Throughout most of his life, Bendel was addicted to drugs, specifically cocaine and heroin, and he began using these when he was a teenager, and began committing offences to get money to fund his habit. On the 20th of April 2010, he was stopped by the police who searched him and found cocaine on him, so he was given another caution. However, within 6 weeks, he committed his first serious offence, which he was caught for. On the 3rd of June 2010, Bendel attacked an Asian man walking alone in the street, and when this individual resisted, he beat him before robbing him of his belongings. The beating this man received was far in excess of what was necessary to commit the offence. It was clear that Bendel was getting off on the use of extreme violence. Before the victim lost consciousness, he remembered Bendel racially abusing him while he punched him again and again and again. Bendel was soon caught and, on the 30th of June 2011, was sent to prison for 3 years for robbery. Bendel had interactions with various professionals in prison, one of whom described him as, quote, cold and calculated and quite psychopathic. He was assessed to be highly manipulative and a man fully in control of his emotions who was willing to use extreme violence in order to get his own way. Bendel was released in August 2012 and seems to have stayed off the police's radar for a few years, but this obviously doesn't mean he wasn't committing crimes. During this time period, it's known now that he was violently abusing a woman who was terrified of him. Not much information is available about this woman, but I shall call her B. It's not clear what behaviour B was subjected to, but as I've tried to reinforce time and time again, the violence that people are willing to use behind closed doors towards people they supposedly love is often far worse than what they use towards others. So, considering this is a man who apparently enjoyed killing animals, I can only imagine the horror this woman was subjected to and fully understand why she felt unable to report this to the authorities until later, as he would have probably killed her had he found out. Bendel could not stay out of trouble for long, and on the 7th of June 2015, he walked into a newsagent's in Swindon, run by Narendra Patel, who was 62 years old at the time. Mr. Patel later recalled, quote, he was pacing up and down the shop, looking out the window. I was suspicious as soon as he came in. I kept a close eye on him. I remember he phoned someone and was still staring out the window before he finished a call and moved over to the fridge. He was lurking there for a while before deciding to buy some cold drinks. I put them into a bag for him, and then he went back to the window and made a second call. After finishing that second call, he came back to the counter and pulled up his sleeve and showed me a knife with a blade of about 7 inches. He said, "Give me your money and cigarettes," but I instinctively reached for the golf club I keep by the counter for protection. I grabbed it and tried to hit him over the head with it as he lunged towards me, but he ducked down just in time. I then ran around the counter and chased him out of the shop like the coward he is. He ran off. He was far too quick for me. A manhunt was started, but, likely feeling the heat and knowing he would be caught, Bendel handed himself in to the police. On the 21st of August 2015, he was again sent to prison for 3 years, this time for attempted robbery and possession of a knife. Bendel's violent behaviour was escalated significantly, and in early 2016 he was refused to transfer to another prison. He then spent the next few months plotting his revenge, and on the 10th of May 2016, he attacked a prison officer, beating them so severely they were knocked unconscious, and subsequently had to have surgery for their injuries and months of rehabilitation to regain full mobility. 2 other officers were also assaulted when they stepped in to try and save their colleague. Whilst Bendel was in prison, B had reached out to the probation service to warn them how dangerous he was and that she'd been victimised by him. She was clearly terrified that he would come back after her. These concerns would have been heightened when on the 31st of October 2018, Bendel was released from prison on licence, but he only lasted a matter of weeks before being recalled to prison for drinking to excess and not complying with the terms of his release. He was sent back to prison on the 28th of November 2018 and remained there for the rest of his sentence before being eventually released on the 9th of August 2019. Soon after this release, concerns were reported about risks towards young girls. So on top of everything, being a violent thug, a bully, a racist, and a domestic abuse perpetrator, Damien Bendel was also a paedophile. In May 2020, Wiltshire police were receiving reports about him grooming a vulnerable 16-year-old girl who was in care, but also him trying to start sexual relationships with younger girls who were in the same position. No doubt Bendel saw these girls as easy prey, so he used them to get his sexual needs met, but also he likely believed he could easily control them. The police were so concerned that they assessed Bendel as posing a high risk of serious harm to children, i.e. they believed he was already or was about to offend against female children. This information was shared with the probation service, but, as will be highlighted later, ignored when it really mattered. The real danger of psychopaths like Damien Bendel is their ability to charm and manipulate. Their ability to portray a superficial charm that draws others in. Whilst Bendel was a violent psychopathic criminal, when it came to women, he would initially present himself as a gentleman, drawing them into his web, and then he would show them the monster he really was. But by this point, it was too late. They were under his control, too terrified to leave. This is how he convinced 35-year-old Terry Harris to begin a relationship with him after the pair met on a dating website in March 2020. Terry had recently broken up with her partner of 14 years, Jason Bennett, who was the father of her 2 children, Lacey, aged 11, and John Paul, aged 13. Terry was smitten with Bendel, and within a few months, he'd moved to Sheffield in South Yorkshire to be with her. This move served 2 purposes. It meant that he could more easily control Terry by being close to her, but also he could avoid the police, as he was a wanted man. This was due to him setting fire to a car in Swindon on the 9th of May 2020, whilst drunk and high on cannabis. Whilst Terry was completely taken with Bendel, her friends and family were extremely concerned. Like when he was a child, Bendel had to be the big man and would brag about his criminal past and that he was on the run from the police. Bendel was a leech. He didn't work and instead spent what little money he had on alcohol and drugs. Terry paid for everything, and she was essentially living with 3 children. Terry's mother, Angie Smith, was sure that her daughter was being coercively controlled. She saw that Terry always seemed to be walking on eggshells around Bendel, possibly fearful that if she said the wrong thing he would kick off. He was also stopping her from seeing her mum and made her cut contact with her friends. Angie begged her daughter to leave Bendel, but she was in love with him, and the pair quickly began living together in a property in Killarmarsh, a village just outside Sheffield. Terry became pregnant early in the relationship and was ecstatic. However, Bendel twisted this happy occasion into fueling his paranoia that she'd been cheating on him with another man, and neighbours heard him interrogating her about this. As I've mentioned in many of my videos, sexual jealousy is an extremely worrying sign in their relationship and often shows the extremely paranoid and irrational behaviour of a perpetrator, with them being convinced their partner will cheat on them and leave them without any evidence, so they'll control them in order to make sure this doesn't happen. With a roof over his head and money in his pocket, Bendel could indulge his addictions to drink and drugs, and when he ran out of money, he would sell items in the house. Everything was about Bendel's needs and wants, and he expected others to cater to them while he sat around high and pissed, contributing nothing to the house or society, which was basically a template for his whole life. In May 2021, the police finally caught up with Bendel, and he was arrested for the arson in Wiltshire the year before and was taken to court. Unfortunately, it's at this point that the inexplicable mistakes were made, which likely contributed to the horror which occurred just a few months later. In both the US and the UK, and likely courts across the world, it's common for a report to be prepared by probation to assist in sentencing. In America, I believe this is called a pre-sentence investigation. In the UK, it's simply called a pre-sentence report. In the UK, this document basically contains the probation officer's analysis of the offence itself, but in a wider context, is to assess the risk of the individual by taking into account various factors, including previous criminal history, level of remorse, motivation to change, etc. This document should be a thorough breakdown of the individual, taking information from various sources, for example police intelligence, and giving the court an indication of whether this person is safe to be in the community and could be supervised by probation, or whether they need to be sent to prison to protect the public. Unfortunately, the probation officer who wrote the report did not do their job. They appear to have based their observations and conclusions solely on what Bendel said, a charming but dangerous psychopath. He made statements about wanting to change and how, this time, he would comply with the rules. The officer made no inquiries with anyone or checked his long criminal history. If they had, they would have seen his history of violent behaviour, both in and out of prison, warning flags everywhere about his behaviour towards partners, and concerns about his risk towards children. Due to this lack of diligence, they told the court that in their assessment, Damien Bendel posed a low risk of serious harm to partners and to children, i.e. no risk at all. They also recommended that Bendel not go to prison and instead be subject to a curfew at the property he was living in with Terry Harris. So basically he needed to wear an ankle bracelet, which meant that he could not leave the house between certain hours, usually overnight, and this is seen as a punishment as it restricts a person's liberty. I'm not sure what the thinking is in America, but in the UK, curfewing a domestic abuse perpetrator to an address with a partner, let alone a pregnant partner, is potentially extremely dangerous. It basically means that perpetrators are forced to be in the property with their victim for as long as the curfew is in place. Being in the home for more time often leads to more conflict and increases the chance of an incident occurring. In addition, checks should have been done with the homeowner to see whether they wanted the person there. Toria was not contacted and asked her opinion. We will never know what would have happened had the report been different. The judge may have still decided not to send Bendel to prison, but the information presented to them was so off the mark as to be negligent. So, on the 9th of June 2021, Damien Bendel was sentenced to a suspended prison sentence and a curfew, and he went back to the property with Terry and the children. Only 3 months later, their address would be the site of a horrific act of pure evil. In the late evening of the 18th of September 2021, Damien Bendel was in the property with Terry Harris and her 2 children, John Paul, aged 13, and Lacey, aged 11, who were getting ready for bed. Tragically, a 3rd child was also present, who had come round for a sleepover, Lacey's best friend, 11-year-old Connie Gent. Bendel claimed later he'd been on a 3-day cocaine binge by this point. What happened next will never be known for sure, but Bendel took a claw hammer and attacked all 4 of the people in the house. Each of the 4 victims died in different rooms, suggesting that as soon as the attacks began, everyone ran for their lives. He then went room to room, searching for his victims, and he then repeatedly struck them in the head with the hammer. The attacks were so vicious that their skulls were described as being, quote, smashed in with the force of the attack. The whole house was covered in blood. What Bendel did next is almost beyond belief, but after beating 11-year-old Lacey almost to death, he took her into the bedroom with the body of her dead or dying pregnant mother and raped her. The pathologist stated that Lacey was raped after she'd been attacked and while she was dying from the horrific head injuries inflicted on her by Bendel. When he had finished, Bendel sat with the bodies for several hours. He made no attempts to clean up the house. He was then caught on CCTV carrying a bag which contained John Paul's Xbox. He then took a taxi and exchanged this game's console for drugs. Footage was also caught of him going into a corner shop. No sign of distress or concern. Remember, this is a man who had just murdered 4 people whose bodies were lying where he'd left them. It was at this point, around 12 hours after the murders, when Bendel made the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, confessing to murdering 4 people. This is the police body cam footage of the officers who arrived at the scene.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Alright, come to me. Mate, have you got anything on you that you shouldn't have? No, there's no weapons or nothing.
Right, do you just want to undo your coat? Have you armed yourself?
Yeah.
You have?
Have you stabbed yourself, mate?
I can see blood on your hands.
Yeah. Anywhere else?
Just my chest, 4 inches in with a bread knife.
Can we have a look?
Yeah, and one on the stomach. I bled quite.
Right, do you want to? Yes. No, just stay there.
I just don't want to be in front of everyone.
Alright, just go on the corner. Alright, stand here. Stay here.
Right, we're told, I know what's going to happen to you now, mate.
Well, I know what's going to happen when we go to prison, obviously, again.
Why, what have you done? Have you done something to anyone else?
Yeah.
What have you done?
I've murdered 4 people.
He's been calm and compliant, but he's got some stab wounds to his chest. They're not oozing blood, but he's saying that his family are inside and that he believes he has murdered them.
Do you want to go?
Are you alright for me to go in?
Yeah.
Damien, at 07:47 hours, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence. Do not mention when questioned something later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Your arrest is necessary to protect you from harm, to prevent your disappearance, for a prompt and effective investigation. Okay? We're going to get you up, we're going to put you in the back of the van. Stand up.
I want to raise a couple of things. Firstly, him stating, almost with an air of contempt, that he's going back to prison again, as though this is somehow unreasonable. Also, his half-baked attempt to end his own life. No doubt everything about this situation was about control. He called the police so he could control the narrative. He harmed himself to make himself look like a man who was so horrified by what he'd done that he tried to end his own life. This was ignoring the fact that it would later be easily proved that he was so distressed that he didn't call the police or an ambulance and instead went out to score drugs by selling the possessions of a child he'd just murdered. Bendel was all ready with his defence, telling the officers, quote, "The whole house is covered in claret. I used a hammer. I didn't realise what I'd done." He also reinforced them that he'd been on a drug bender for the last few days. I was so high, he couldn't remember a thing. However, this callous, evil monster couldn't help but brag about his crimes, saying to the officers, quote, "I bet you don't get 4 murders in Killamarsh, do you?" As though the police would somehow be excited they were in the presence of a celebrity, or should be somehow in awe of the coward who ended the lives of children. There was no dispute about who had committed the offences, and Damien Bendel was charged with 4 counts of murder, as well as 1 count of rape, and was remanded into custody to await his fate. Damien Bendel tried every tactic in the book in court. He claimed that he was so high, he'd suffered from amnesia when the killings occurred. He also initially flatly refused to admit raping 11-year-old Lacey, inevitably due to knowing the treatment child sex offenders get in prison. Bendel offered to plead guilty to manslaughter, basically acknowledging that he killed all 4 victims, but denying that it was premeditated. This was rejected. It was easy to disprove Bendel's lies, including the fact that his amnesia around the killings was so profound, yet he had the gumption to bag up the games console, make his way into town, and score drugs. Also, he'd wasted hours to call for help, and, when police did arrive, he was cold, detached, and acting like a man who'd stolen a bag of sweets and not ended the lives of 4 people. On December the 21st, 2021, at Derby Crown Court, knowing the writing was on the wall, Damien Bendel pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. That same afternoon, he stood before Mr. Justice Sweeney KC to be sentenced. As a last-ditch attempt to gain sympathy through his barrister, Bendel claimed that he was now remorseful for his actions. The judge was having none of it. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated the murders were, quote, "brutal, vicious and cruel, and they were committed against defenceless children and a woman he claimed to have loved, who was in the early stages of pregnancy, carrying his child." He then sentenced him for the murder and rape of 11-year-old Lacey Bennett, as well as the murders of 13-year-old John Paul Bennett, 11-year-old Connie Gent, and 35-year-old Terry Harris. Damien Bendel was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that he will never be released from prison. The agony the families of the victims suffered is beyond description. Angie Smith, Terry's mother, spoke about the utter devastation from losing not only her daughter, her only child, but also her grandchildren. She said, quote, "Since then, my life has been one purely of existence. I will try and put across some of my feelings and how much of a void this senseless crime has had on my life. Some days, I question the meaning of existence. He has taken everything from me, and I wish he had taken my life, not theirs. I struggle to explain to my elderly parents what happened. I don't know myself, but I must accept I may never know, as the only person who knows is Bendel. Terry was my only child. I'll never have any other children or grandchildren. They are the most precious things in my life. I'll give anything to be able to spend a moment with them." She also spoke about sitting in the mortuary between the bodies of her murdered family, in total disbelief to the horror she was experiencing. The injuries Damien Bendel inflicted were so horrific, I cannot even imagine what her last image of her daughter and grandchildren must have been. Jason Bennett, John Paul and Lacey's father, released a statement which said, quote, "The murder of my 2 children has destroyed and taken my life away. Life now seems pointless. Looking forward to the future is painful and difficult. If it wasn't for my partner, I wouldn't be here now. Occasionally, I do become distracted by what has happened. My mind goes back to the trauma of how they died. I have a story in my head of how they died and relive the trauma. John and Lacey were innocent. So many family and friends have been traumatized. I won't see them grow up or be given the opportunity to be a granddad. I'm angry their life, their future has been taken. I'm lost without them. I need them." Just 9 days after his little girl was murdered, Charlie Gent, father of little Connie, agreed to be interviewed as he wanted to share an important message, which I think needs to be shared with all of you.
Connie had the ability to always make me smile. She was like my best friend. There are no words. I'm gonna miss my baby girl.
It is just 9 days since Charlie Gent was told his 11-year-old daughter Connie was one of 4 people who'd been killed during a sleepover at her best friend's house.
Connie was, well, one of the nicest girls you'll ever meet, I suppose. She was special. She could have been anything she wanted to be. I'd rather it be me than her. Yeah, she got a whole life out of it.
Charlie had been told just a few hours after Connie's body was discovered at the house in Killamarsh in Derbyshire last week.
Since I found out, it doesn't even feel real. I wake up every morning and hope. Yeah, it's all been a bad nightmare, but yeah, it hasn't.
Connie's best friend Lacey Bennett was also killed that night. They'd spent their last day setting up a sweet stall to raise money for charity. They would often sleep over together, not something her father ever worried about.
The last thing you think of, isn't it, when, like, your daughter's sleeping out, they're having a good time, aren't they? Not a million ways round. You could try and change it or change the events leading up to it. Place blame everywhere you want, but I don't know. It'll eat you alive, I think, in the end, won't it?
Charlie says he wants people to know about the fun times he had with the daughter he's lost and wanted to be interviewed to urge parents to value their time with their kids. He never knew his most recent day with Connie would be their last.
Anything you remember about that day?
Yeah, just how good she felt to hold. And I say she made me feel.
He says he can now only treasure the memory of every day they spent together.
In January 2023, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Probation published the findings of their review of the case of Damien Bendel to determine why this horrific incident occurred. It's a scathing document and lays the blame squarely on the shoulders of probation, and in particular, the appalling report written by one probation officer for Bendel's sentencing for arson just a few months before the murders. The report reinforces the need for comprehensive checks to be undertaken at court stage so that reports are accurate, give the judge an accurate idea of the risk that a person poses so they can sentence them appropriately. The probation officer in question was apparently fired as a result of their negligence. However, nothing in this report or any kind words or statements of remorse can undo the horror in this case. Hopefully learning will be taken from this report, but it's far too little, far too late. I want to reiterate support services for those experiencing domestic abuse, given that this is a horrific example of the seriousness of this type of offending. Within approximately 18 months of first meeting Terry Harris, Damien Bendel had murdered her and both her children. I want to add a few more numbers for support more regionally in the UK. So, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice and support in England, you can call Refuge's National Domestic Abuse Helpline on 0808 2000 24/7. In Northern Ireland, call the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Helpline on 0808 802 1414. In Scotland, call the Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline on 0800 027 1234. And in Wales, call Live Fear Free on 0808 80 10 800. If you're in the US, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 1-800-799-SAFE. You can also get additional support from the website for each of these organisations, and all the contact information will be in the description box. Also, I need to mention Clare's Law, which is a way for people to access information from the police if they're concerned that they or a loved one are in a relationship with a domestic abuser. The point of this scheme is to enable people to find out about the history of these men. It's named after a woman called Claire Wood, who, aged just 36, was murdered in February 2009 by her ex-boyfriend, George Appleton, who then killed himself a few days later. Appleton had a history of violently abusing his partners and was known to the police as being an extremely dangerous man. The scheme is officially known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme in England and Wales, and in Scotland, it's known as the Disclosure Scheme for Domestic Abuse. In Northern Ireland, it's called the Domestic Violence and Abuse Disclosure Scheme. For each force area, they have a form you can fill out on their website. So, for example, if you type in Clare's Law Essex Police, you get taken to this website. You then add your postcode to make sure you're communicating with the right force, and then you're given options of how you want to gain a disclosure, either online or in person. Most forces will look to give you information within 28 days. My personal preference would be to go into a police station and ask them about the scheme. Then, you can fill in the forms in a place of safety. You won't be handed a huge file. The scheme doesn't allow you to get all information. It's about proportionality. Someone will determine what they think you need to know. I know that doesn't sound great, but if there's information to suggest that you or someone else is in danger, you will be told. Damien Bendel pleaded guilty to these offences eventually, and so there was no trial. He was simply sentenced, so no explanation was given in court as to why he committed these offences. However, from looking at this case, I think I have quite a good idea of why he did what he did. But in order to understand this, I need to outline the profile of Damien Bendel. But first, I want to point out that the conclusions that I've reached shocked even me, and I think it makes the unimaginable horror in this case even worse. So please end the video now if you need to. Specifically, it's clear that Bendel was a psychopath, a weak, pathetic man, devoid of any emotion, who believed that others should do his bidding and cater to his needs. This included in relationships. He lived rent-free in the house with Terry and the children, and likely felt this was his domain, and despite his behaviour, he was entitled to act in any manner he wanted. As with other domestic abuse perpetrators, defiance of his will or calling him out on his behaviour was met with punishment. I think that Bendel's beliefs about entitlement within the family home included using this environment to indulge his paedophilic sexual interest in children, something the police were already very concerned about. Unfortunately, I think the trigger to this incident was something to do with Lacey. Whether Bendel was caught doing something or something was disclosed, I think that Terry confronted him. Her daring to question him on his behaviour meant she needed to be punished, so he attacked her with the hammer. He then went around attacking the children so as to not leave any witnesses, leaving no one alive to tell the police what really happened that night, and also so he could spin his web of lies. He then did something unspeakable. He raped Lacey, and a terrible detail in the reports I've seen is that he deliberately took her into the same room where her mother was lying, either dead or dying, in order to do this. I think that Bendel deliberately raped Lacey in front of her mother, with him hoping that she would hear and see him doing this to her daughter. This would show her that he was in control and that he'd do whatever he wanted with her children. He wanted the last thing she saw to be him violating her daughter. This conclusion, if accurate, sickens me, and I think epitomizes the evil of Damien Bendel. He is where he belongs, and as a child rapist and murderer, I do not imagine his time in prison will be easy. Joachim Kroll was a German serial killer who killed at least 13 girls and women, as well as one man, between 1955 and 1976 in the Ruhr area of West Germany. He was a deranged sexual psychopath who raped, murdered, mutilated, and consumed the flesh of many of his victims. He was eventually caught whilst the body parts of one of his victims was simmering on the stove. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Joachim George Kroll was born on the 17th of April 1933 in Hindenburg, in the former province of Upper Silesia, which is now part of modern Poland. He was one of 8 children. Kroll is described as being a, quote, weak child who was of below average intelligence, with recent estimates putting his IQ at 76, well below what is considered, quote, unquote, average. Kroll was a shy and withdrawn child who was described as a loner who had few friends. He only attended school until the age of 8 due to his learning difficulties, and instead regressed into his own little world in his room. Kroll's father left the family home to fight in World War II, but was taken prisoner by the Russians. And, although it appears he survived the war in a prisoner of war camp, he didn't return back to the family home. Because of the war, the family moved to the Ruhr area of Germany, moving as far from the Eastern Front as they could. Kroll later told police that when he was a teenager, he had witnessed someone slaughtering pigs and had become sexually aroused by the sight of their blood. Thoughts about strangling, killing, and butchering women and children became the focus of his masturbatory fantasies. It got to the point where he could not get aroused unless he was imagining violence against women and female children. Kroll was a failure with women. He could not speak to them, and when it came to performing sexually, he could not get an erection, so he became fixated on sexual acts with unconscious or dead partners. On the 21st of January 1955, the only real link Kroll had to society, his mother, died. She appears to be the only reason he did not escalate his behaviour before. Within weeks, Kroll began a murder spree that lasted over 20 years, with his crimes escalating in savagery to the point where he committed acts of pure evil. On the 8th of February 1955, just weeks after the death of his mother, Kroll was in the village of Valstedt when he came across 19-year-old Irmgard Strell, a runaway who was walking along a road. Kroll invited her to go for a walk into the woods. Around 120 metres into the woods and out of view of the road, Kroll tried to kiss Irmgard. She resisted. He then stabbed her 4 times in the neck, then strangled her, before raping her. It seems likely while she was still alive, and then also after she died. He also cut her stomach open, so she was found with her guts hanging out of her body when she was found 5 days later. A large quantity of semen was found in and on her body, which led police to believe they were looking for more than one attacker. At some point in 1956, Kroll strangled to death and raped 12-year-old Erika Schaletta in an area of Germany where the city of Bottrop now stands. It's believed that there was then a break of around 3 years until Kroll claimed his next victim, and this appears in part to him being careful about his offending. He would only commit crimes in certain areas, often with significant gaps between the murders, in order to avoid detection. To meet his need for violent sexual acts between murders, he acquired a number of sex dolls, including ones that resembled small children, as well as a full-size plastic one which resembled an adult woman. Kroll would masturbate while strangling these dolls, and, with regards to the life-size doll, would have his hands around its throat whilst having sex with it. After each murder, he would come home and have sex with his dolls, no doubt reliving the crimes he'd just committed. His next confirmed murder was on the 16th of June 1959, when Kroll came across 24-year-old Clara Frieda Tesma. He came across her in the district of Rheinhausen, near the Graf Spee Bridge, over the River Rhine. Kroll stated that he grabbed Clara and tried to drag her into some woods, but she resisted, so he hit her over the head. He then tried to undress her, but she came to and fought back. During this time, he strangled her before fleeing the scene. Police investigated this crime, and a local man was arrested. Unfortunately, other men being considered suspects for Kroll's crimes is a recurring theme. On this occasion, the man arrested, Heinrich Ott, apparently hanged himself in prison. Just over a month later, on the 26th of July 1959, Kroll lured 16-year-old Manuela Nott into a forest outside the city of Essen, where he strangled her to death and then had sex with her body. Due to the isolated location, Kroll was able to spend many hours with Manuela's body, and he masturbated over her corpse. When her body was found, the amount of semen at the crime scene, again they'd investigators believed that she had been attacked by multiple men. However, this crime was different. Kroll later said that, quote, on a whim, he decided to cut pieces of Manuela's body off in order to try and see what human flesh tasted like. He cut pieces off her buttocks and thighs, took them home, cooked them, and ate them. Kroll later stated that he enjoyed the taste and decided to cannibalize further victims in order to save on his grocery bills. This is clearly not true. It's apparent that Kroll got a sexual thrill from eating his victims, and this added another element to his crimes, allowing him to gain even more sexual gratification after the event. 6 months later, a man, likely with significant mental health issues, walked into a police station and confessed to the murder of Manuela. He later retracted his confession, but spent 3 years in prison before being exonerated. After Manuela's murder, Kroll would stalk and seek out women and children who he believed looked, quote, tender, who would provide the sweetest meat. Again, there appears to be a break in Kroll's offending. It did not strike again until the 23rd of April 1962. On this date, 13-year-old Petra Gies was at a fair with a friend. It's believed that Kroll saw her and followed her, then lured her into some woods outside the town of Dinslaken before strangling her with her own scarf, raping her, and then mutilating her body. Kroll removed both of Petra's buttocks before sawing off her hand and left forearm. He then took these home and ate them. The next day, her body was found, and police quickly made an arrest, a local man who had a previous history of sex offences. He was tried, convicted, and sent to prison for 12 years, eventually serving 6 before he was released. On the 4th of June 1962, 13-year-old Monica Taffel was walking to school in the Duisburg district of Walsum. Unfortunately, Kroll was also in the area, looking for someone to kill and eat. Kroll approached Monica when she was on an isolated stretch of road and dragged her into a rye field. He strangled her to death before masturbating over her corpse. He then cut meat from her buttocks and her thighs. When Monica did not return home from school, her frantic parents called the police, who launched an extensive search, including use of a police helicopter. Her broken body was seen from the air, and officers went and recovered her remains. It was noted that pieces of meat cut from her body were around the size of steaks. Again, a local man was arrested, 34-year-old Walter Quicker, but he was soon released. However, his neighbours thought he was guilty, and he lost everything as a result of his arrest. In October 1962, he went into some nearby woods and hanged himself. Victim 7 was 12-year-old Barbara Bruder, who was abducted by Kroll on the 3rd of September 1962 as she walked from her home to a playground in Lutzenkirchen. Kroll strangled her to death, then had sex with her corpse. Her body was never found. On the 2nd of August 1965, Kroll was lurking around a lover's lane in Grossenbaum when he came across a car containing 25-year-old Hermann Schmitz and Marion Wien. Some reports say the pair were just sitting in the car, others state that Kroll watched the pair have sex. Regardless, he snuck up on the vehicle and used a knife to deflate one of the tyres. Hermann got out to investigate and was promptly attacked, being stabbed in the heart. Clearly, Kroll's main target was Marion, but she was able to fend him off, get behind the wheel of the car, and drive away. Hermann was Kroll's only male victim. Likely worrying he'd be caught, Kroll went to ground and did not kill again for a year. His next victim was 20-year-old Ursula Rowling, who, on the 13th of September 1966, was at an ice cream parlour in the town of Marl. Kroll saw her and waited for her to leave, which she did at 7 p.m. He then followed her, and when she took a shortcut through a park to get home, he attacked. Kroll described killing Ursula as follows, quote, "I saw this woman in the park. She was young, with short hair. I spoke to her and then grabbed her around the neck with my right arm. I dragged her into the bushes and threw her on the ground. I choked her until she stopped moving. Then I took off her pants and her other things, and I did it to her. I left her lying there and took the train back to Duisburg. When I got home, I was still hot, and I had it with the doll, and did it with my hand a couple of times." A local man was arrested and questioned about the murder. He was innocent, but tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, and he subsequently committed suicide by drowning himself. 3 months later, on the 2nd of December 1966, Kroll attacked 5-year-old Iona Hark in the city of Wuppertal. Instead of strangling her, he drowned her in a river, stating what he knew what it was like to see someone die by drowning. He then raped her corpse and cut meat from her buttocks, shoulders, and thighs, which he took home and ate. Kroll was becoming more confident and more arrogant, and he began to offend closer and closer to Ho, and even target people known to him. In 1967, he settled in the town of Grafenhausen and began to befriend the local children, who called him, quote, uncle. On the 22nd of June 1967, he lured one of these children into a field and showed them pornography, hoping they would become sexually aroused. When they did not, and they ran away screaming, Kroll chased this child and began to choke her. But at this point, the siren for the change of shift as local man went off, so the area was swarming with workers. So, he left this child and scurried away. He moved out of the area the next day to avoid questions from the police, but the child's parents would not report this incident until years later, after Kroll's capture. On the 22nd of June 1967, Kroll killed his oldest victim, 61-year-old Maria Hetgen. Kroll came across her whilst he was walking on the banks of Lake Baldini. He stated later he got a, quote, tickling feeling all over and went to speak to her. She declined to engage. He then hit her over the head, dragged her into some bushes, strangled, and raped her. Kroll began killing again in 1970, but only claimed one victim during this year, 13-year-old Jutta Ran. Kroll followed her off a train at a hostel train station, and in order to get home, she needed to walk through some woods, and this is where she was attacked. She was strangled to death and then raped by Kroll. A local man was arrested and in prison for 15 months for this murder, before eventually being released. Kroll's rampage was finally brought to an end in 1976, but only because of his own stupidity and arrogance. During this year, 10-year-old Corinne Topher was raped and strangled on her way to school in the town of Dinslaken. On the 3rd of July 1976, Kroll's 14th and last victim, 4-year-old Marion Ketter, disappeared from a playground in the Lahr district of Duisburg. This was the same area that Kroll was living in and only a short distance away from his apartment block. Rather than killing her in the open and leaving her body, Kroll abducted Marion and took her back to his apartment. He then strangled and raped her before butchering her body. He flushed her internal organs down the communal toilet, which soon became blocked. Later that day, this was noticed by one of his neighbours, who also used the toilet, and he asked Kroll about it. Bizarrely, Kroll said the toilet was, quote, clogged with guts. Seen disposing of bloody clothing in a bin outside. The next day, police were searching for the missing girl and making house-to-house inquiries, which led them to Kroll's apartment. The neighbour told police about his strange conversation with Kroll and about the bloody items he had seen him disposing of. The police recovered these items and so were instantly suspicious, and a plumber was called. He confirmed that the drains were blocked with human organs, specifically child's intestines, lungs, kidneys, liver and heart. The police went straight into Kroll's apartment, and what they found inside was like something out of a horror movie. In the freezer, they found bags of human flesh, both from Marion, but it would appear from previous victims. On the stove, they found Marion's severed hand, boiling in a pot with carrots and potatoes. Kroll was arrested on the spot, and so, after more than 20 years and at least 14 victims, Joachim Kroll's reign of terror was at an end. Khawar was originally only suspected of the murder of Marion Ketter, which he freely confessed to. However, he then admitted to a further 13 murders, none of which he was a suspect for, and which, as already stated, other men had confessed to and been arrested for. Khawar went into graphic detail about each murder, where he found the victims, what they looked like, and what he did to them. Khawar was taken to each murder site and forced to engage in reenactments to demonstrate what he'd done to his victims. These reconstructions were photographed, leading to, I would suggest, some truly bizarre moments forever captured on film. I assume this was deemed necessary to ensure that Khawar was being honest and was not, like others had before him, making false confessions. Bizarrely, Khawar seemed to think that because he confessed to multiple murders, he would then receive an operation to rid him of his homicidal tendencies and then be released back into the community. Instead, police were able to gather enough evidence to charge him with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was then remanded to prison to await his day in court. His fate was handed down on the 8th of April 1982, when, after a 151-day trial, Khawar was found guilty on all charges and given a life sentence. However, this was only translated to about 9 years, as, on the 1st of July 1991, at the age of 58, Joachim Kroll, the quote raw cannibal, died in Rheinbach prison. He never expressed any remorse for his crimes. I must confess that I didn't know about the crimes of Joachim Kroll before making this video. I'm surprised it's not more well known. Instead, Armin Mivers is probably the most notorious German cannibal, but I think you'll agree Kroll's crimes were far more horrific and are more akin to the offences of people like Jeffrey Dahmer. However, this unknown case, to me at least, gives me a new profile to work on. So it's clear that Kroll was an inadequate and weak man, one who wanted to approach women but couldn't. I think there's information missing about his past, something about his hatred of women. Potentially, this resulted from his rejection by them, or something else. Regardless, he had fancies about violence towards women, no doubt enjoying feeling total control and power over them, whilst they cried out as he inflicted pain on them, whether this was from beating them or attacking them with weapons. These fantasies speak to the wider motivation of Kroll's offending, to punish, dominate and control. At some point, these fantasies were not enough, and Kroll got dogs to live them out. But, over time, he needed further escalation and began to target people. It's important to point out the sadistic nature of his offending, shown by how he killed his victims, either strangling them or, on one occasion, drowning them. Strangulation is an up-close and personal way to kill someone, literally looking into their eyes whilst you squeeze the life out of them. It's a horrific way to die. It's like his victims fought, cried and screamed for their lives while he wrung the life out of them. The same with drowning. He would have held the victim's head underwater and felt them fight and eventually slacken against his grip. No doubt Kroll was sexually aroused during the killing itself, but this was just the beginning. He was clearly a man who derived gratification from every single part of his process. When his victims were dead, Kroll now had a sexual partner who, unlike the women before, could not reject him. He was in total control and could do whatever he wanted. No complaints, no judgment, and he would violate their bodies sometimes for hours. Kroll predominantly targeted children. I believe this was likely for 2 reasons. Firstly, he was clearly a paedophile, but also, he was clearly not a physically imposing man, and, by targeting children, he would believe that he could overpower them and ensure the kill. The body parts he took, I think, were his trophies. In the short term, he could sit and admire them whilst continuing to masturbate and having sex with his dolls, but then, he consumed his victim's flesh. Again, this was clearly sexually motivated. I think he was aroused and got a huge sexual thrill with each mouthful, as it enabled him to relive the crime itself. But also, it could be argued that devouring someone is the ultimate act of domination by a predator and the ultimate act of submission by the prey. He dehumanized his victims to the point where they were just things, just sacks of meat to get his sexual kicks. Kroll never showed any remorse for his actions. In fact, I think his confession was to brag about how prolific he was. He had no empathy for any of the people he killed. This is clearly indicative of his psychopathic personality. But, in a wider context, I think that Crowell didn't see anything wrong in his behaviour. He knew there were laws prohibiting the acts he committed, so he had to avoid detection, but like didn't understand or care why. I think this is because his whole life revolved around fantasizing about and committing acts of complete depravity, and to him, this was normal. His complete disconnect from the reality of how others saw his behaviour, I think, was shown by him believing that the authorities would simply give him some sort of operation, stop him killing, and then pat him on the head and send him on his way. Absolute madness. Luckily, instead, the authority threw him in a deep, dark hole where he spent the remainder of his days. But this was only the next 9 years, meaning that he served a total of 7 months for each of the murders he committed, and these were only the ones he remembered. It's like he killed many more. Just after midnight on Friday, March the 13th, 2009, a 999 call was received reporting a man had collapsed at a property at 14 Arthur Street in the town of Chiltern in County Durham in the UK. When paramedics attended, they found 35-year-old Andrew Gardner, a vulnerable man due to underlying cognitive issues, dead in the living room. The paramedics were told that Andrew had been assaulted in a bar fight, had come home and collapsed, but the police were quickly called, when it was noted that Andrew was malnourished and his body was covered with new and old injuries. Andrew had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks alive had been a living nightmare, during which time he'd been tortured, including being burned, starved, beaten, as well as having noughts and crosses carved into his body, using him as some sort of human game board. 3 people were responsible: 24-year-old Simon Nichols, 44-year-old Stephen Martin, and the ringleader, 28-year-old Claire Nichols, a sadistic, psychopathic manipulator who not only inflicted horrific injuries on Andrew, but did this in front of her young children, and sickeningly, even encouraged them to participate. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Andrew Gardner was born in around 1974 in the town of Gateshead in Tyne and Wear in northeast England to Ken and Jean Gardner. He had significant learning disabilities, which were diagnosed when he was a child. Andrew had a close relationship with his 2 brothers and his parents, and they were a very tight family. There's no indication that Andrew was ever subject to or experienced violence or abuse in the home. In fact, his childhood was very loving. However, in school, he was the subject of bullying, with his peers taking advantage of him due to his naivety and kind nature. But, despite his own experiences of abuse, Andrew was described as a loving, polite and quiet young man who was never violent and who would try to diffuse situations if he could. He had a kind heart, but unfortunately was always a target of those looking to exploit him. In 2005, at the age of 31, Andrew met 23-year-old Claire Nichols, a single mother with 3 children, who had a history of violence towards intimate partners and an evidence history of sadistic behaviour. Unfortunately, this meeting would end in Andrew's death just 4 years later. Claire Nichols was born in around 1982 and was raised in Portsmouth in Hampshire. Given that 2 of the perpetrators in this case have the same surname, I'll refer to her by her first name moving forward. In contrast to the happy environment that Andrew grew up in, Claire was raised in a dysfunctional home, repeatedly witnessed domestic abuse between her parents, who eventually split up. Claire left the family home when she was 15 years old, and 3 years later, in around the year 2000, she began a relationship with a man called John Peterson. Whilst Claire was only 18, Peterson was 42 years old and had previously served in the Royal Navy. Peterson would later testify on calls about Claire, calling her a, quote, she-devil, and saying, quote, she beat and battered me all the years I was with her, 4 or 5 times a week. She was horrible, a control freak who would flip all the time. She'd throw her shoes, punch me, have a go, and verbally abuse me for the least thing. If I went to the shops without her, she'd attack me. If I went to do the gardening, she'd do the same. I still have nightmares. However, this is where the story begins to get complicated, as it's important to point out that John Peterson was a convicted paedophile. Claire was fully aware of this, and not only stayed with him, but the pair had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Social services became involved, and basically told Claire that she either needed to leave Peterson or lose the children. Rather than safeguarding her own children and doing what social services stated, she fled north, moving away to Newcastle, but taking Peterson with her. The pair finally separated in 2003, and Peterson only saw Claire after this, where she broke into his property with her new partner, Stephen Martin. Again, the story gets a bit complicated when it's pointed out that Martin had been the long-term partner of Claire's mother for around 7 years before they got together. So he basically moved from mother to daughter. The relationship between Claire and Steve Martin was on and off for around 6 years, with the pair regularly having sex, even if both were in relationships. Later, at court, Martin was found to have an IQ of 59, putting him in the lowest 1% of the population in terms of intelligence. It does appear that he was physically abused by Claire, but his main role was to case to every command. If Claire needed something, she would snap her fingers and he would come running. In 2005, during an apparent break in her relationship with Martin, Claire Nichols met Andrew Gardner. Apparently it had occurred when he was signing up for a learning disability course at the job centre. I want to break here to point out a few things. 3 things specifically. Firstly, it's clear that Claire was a violent, controlling monster in relationships, likely replicated the behaviour she herself had seen as a child. Secondly, is her complete disregard for the welfare of anyone but herself. She allowed her children to be around a sex offender, knowing full well about John Peterson's history. I don't know what previous offences Peterson committed, but in October 2021, he was jailed for 10 years for a historic sex offence where he raped a 5-year-old girl. So he was a dangerous predator who posed a risk to female children, yet Claire had children with him and allowed them, including 2 girls, to be around him. And instead of taking the advice of social services, ran off, taking her children and the paedophile with her. Clearly no one else mattered but Claire. She did not care what her children were exposed to. I was willing to place them at risk. Which brings me on to the third point, the reason why she did this. I think that she stayed with Peterson because he was someone she felt she could easily control. He was a paedophile, likely vilified by everyone who knew him, and likely alone. Someone, she believed, if he reported anything, would not be believed, or potentially others would think he deserved it. She had leverage over him. If he displeased her, she could very easily disclose his offending to anyone she wanted, making his life hell. This fits within a pattern of targeting and beginning relationships with men who were vulnerable or had some other issue which she believed she could exploit. With Steve Martin, he had an extremely low IQ and was basically her lapdog. And then she met Andrew Gardner, who, as I said, she apparently met when he was signing up for a course where people would learn disabilities at the job centre. I can't help but draw the conclusion that Claire approached him and saw him as someone she could control and begin a relationship with for that purpose. Unfortunately, Andrew had no idea about Claire's background and walked into the spider's web. Soon after the relationship began, Andrew and Claire moved in together, and he became a surrogate father for her 3 children. Also living in the property was Claire's younger brother Simon, who was later around 19 or 20 years old when the relationship began in 2005. Simon was again a man of low intelligence, just the sort of person that Claire felt she could dominate, and therefore was useful to her. Within the family home, Claire was a monster, fully in charge. She would exert control any way she wanted and punish any dissent swiftly and forcefully. With her brother Simon, she would beat him if he didn't do household tasks to her satisfaction. However, the main abuse was reserved for Andrew. He was frequently beaten, and this carried on when Claire became pregnant with his child in around 2007. Andrew would be punched repeatedly if he tried to get anything to eat, with him needing to ask permission to eat the food in his own home. He was often starving, as Claire would sometimes forbid him from eating any meals for days, and he had to resort to taking food when she wasn't looking. She would then accuse him of, quote, stealing. Again, this is the food in his own home, and then he would be beaten. Claire went as far as ripping the pockets out of Andrew's trousers, so he could not conceal food from her. The last time that Ken and Jean Gardner, Andrew's parents, physically saw their son was in 2006, when he turned up at their door, looking malnourished and distressed. He was no longer the happy man they remembered. He'd been beaten down, and his spirit was broken. Despite trying to contact him over the years, they had no luck, and this was all due to Claire. She forbid Andrew from contacting his parents. In around 2008, Claire gave birth to a daughter. Andrew's first child, her fourth, and he was forbidden from taking this child to see his parents. In fact, it was not until after his death that Ken or Jean even knew they were grandparents. In July 2008, Claire, her brother Simon, Andrew, and the 4 children moved into 14 Arthur Street in the town of Tilton. It's here that Andrew would suffer a horrifying death less than a year later. Andrew was basically a prisoner in 14 Arthur Street. He was prohibited by Claire from leaving the house without permission, and it got to the point where the neighbours had no idea that Andrew was living in the property, as they rarely even saw him. Also, his parents didn't even know where he was living. Both Claire and Simon would beat Andrew, with Simon acting on the directions of his sister. Andrew was becoming increasingly emaciated, and he was starved for days, being beaten if he dared to take food from the house in order to keep himself alive. He was also forced to sit, watching the family eat a meal while he got nothing. Claire would also verbally abuse Andrew, telling him he was useless and a drain on the household. For some reason, in about February 2009, Claire told Steve Martin to move into the property, meaning there were 8 people in this small house. After this point, the level of torture endured by Andrew escalated significantly. His final months were nothing short of a nightmare. The 3 of them took turns in torturing Andrew, with Claire coming up with various ideas about how to inflict as much pain on him as possible. Andrew had boiling hot water poured over him and was burnt on his body, especially his neck, with a cigarette lighter. He was forbidden from sleeping in a bed or sitting on a sofa. Instead, he was forced to sit and sleep on piles of newspaper, which would be used to soak up the blood from his injuries. Also, Claire would have said to Martin, right in front of Andrew, in order to cause him as much distress as possible. This catalogue of abuse is shocking enough, but it gets worse. It needs to be pointed out that the 4 children in the property were witness to all of this, and in an absolute sign of complete depravity, Claire directed her children, including the daughter she had with Andrew, to participate. These children were only 5, 7, and 9 years old. In court, Claire's 7-year-old son would state, quote, "My ma'am got him and stamped on him. She does that because he's stealing food. He thieved a chocolate bar once. We hit him as well. I scratched him with keys and also hit him with my fists. We wrote swear words on his back. We do that in pen and nail varnish." All 4 children were encouraged to abuse Andrew, and this included cutting him with a knife. After his death, Andrew was found to have noughts and crosses carved into his body, which the children had done under the direction, under the direction of their mother. Andrew was also whipped with wet tea towels, and his injuries later showed that he'd been cut with knives, including receiving a cut to his leg so deep that it exposed his tendons. Andrew was beaten mercilessly by all 3 adults in the home. At the beginning of March 2009, Claire started jumping up and down on Andrew with all of her might, causing severe fractures to his ribs. She would also jump up and then land on him with her knees. This caused severe internal injuries, and Andrew spent his last few days in agony. For approximately a week prior to his death, Andrew was unable to walk and was likely slipping in and out of consciousness in excruciating pain. It's believed that he was merely propped up against the wall, and it would have been clear he was dying, but no one came to help Andrew. Also remember that all 4 children would have seen this, including Andrew's daughter. Sometime in the late evening of the 12th of March 2009, Andrew suffered one final attack, when Simon and Martin held him down, and Claire again jumped on his ribs, as well as kneeing him in this area, with enough force to cause further rib fractures. She also kicked his already burnt feet, fracturing one of them. So sometime during, or immediately after this attack, his body gave out, and Andrew Gardner died. Paramedics who attended the scene on the 13th of March 2009 did not believe a word of what was said to them. Andrew had clearly suffered injuries over weeks and had not died due to some fight. The police reached the same conclusion, and Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin were all arrested on suspicion of murder. The autopsy of Andrew Gardner took 7 hours due to the sheer number of injuries that needed to be documented. Andrew's body was found to have over 150 separate injuries, including numerous fractures, with 21 of these being to his ribs from where he had been stamped on. There was also bleeding on the brain from repeated head injuries. There were also injuries from where Andrew had been slashed with knives, whipped, and burned both with hot water and cigarette lighters. He also had bruises and scars all over his body, as well as blood poisoning. Despite being 35 years old at the time of his death and 5'9", Andrew weighed just 120 pounds, or around 9 stone at the time of his passing. This was due to him having been starved for months. Andrew's injuries were so horrific that they were determined to have been akin to someone who had suffered a traumatic fall from a height or a serious car crash. Andrew's death was determined to have been primarily due to crushing chest injuries, which caused significant trauma to his organs, including his lungs and heart, as well as internal bleeding. Andrew essentially suffocated and bled to death. His final days would have been characterized by excruciating pain. All 3 suspects were interviewed, and both Simon Nichols and Steve Martin broke quickly, trying to save their own skins by pointing the finger at Claire. Simon and Martin both admitted they had physically abused Andrew, but they said that Claire was the ringleader and they were only following her directions, and they were both afraid of defying her due to her violent temper. Claire simply denied everything, claiming that in the hours prior to the 999 call being made, Andrew had been out and apparently been mugged. He then staggered home and collapsed. 30 minutes later, an ambulance was called according to her. However, it was clear that Andrew had been dead for hours by the time help was called. The evidence against the 3 was overwhelming, and they were all charged with the murder of Andrew and remanded into prison to await their day in court. On the 4th of January 2010, Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin went on trial for murder at Teesside Crown Court, having pleaded not guilty to these charges. Simon and Martin essentially continued to dig themselves nice big holes amidst his acts of violence against Andrew, but pointed to Claire as the main instigator, and that they only did these things because they were afraid of her. They seemed to misunderstand that they were essentially admitting to their role in Andrew's death and just implicating Claire rather than actually proving their innocence. During the course of the trial, it's established that, whilst they may have been afraid of Claire, they made choices to become involved. In the case of Steve Martin, he'd been living away from the property and had moved into Arthur Street of his own volition. Claire twisted and turned during the course of the trial. She was initially determined to throw her brother and Martin under the bus, then reverse back over them. She continued to try and exert control over them, including shouting out that they were liars when they were giving evidence implicating her. Realising the writing was on the wall, Claire tried to claim that she had assaulted Andrew, but that his death was accidental, and therefore she was guilty only of manslaughter. This was rejected by the court. When she took the stand, Claire was ripped apart, making statements which were obviously bullshit and made no sense. On the stand, the prosecutor stated, quote, "Miss Nichols, you caused him that excruciating pain because you jumped on him with your knee, a technique you used." She responded by saying, quote, "I admit to jumping on him once. The rest of his broken ribs would have been caused by my brother Simon. I did not realise that my knee going into his ribs was going to cause him so much pain. So she kneed him in the ribs with enough force to break them, but didn't realise this would cause him pain." Absolute bollocks. On the stand, Claire showed herself to be a psychopath, a woman without remorse. Her crocodile tears were a facade, trying to gain sympathy from the jury and avoid taking any responsibility for the torture and murder of an innocent and vulnerable man. The jury saw through her lies, and all 3 were convicted of murder. On the 22nd of January 2010, Claire and Simon Nichols stood to be sentenced before Judge Peter Fox. His sentencing remarks noted that the death of Andrew Gardner was an act of sadism. He stated that Claire was a controlling, manipulative, callous and calculating woman who has a, quote, "deeply entrenched personality disorder." He said that she had set a, quote, "dreadful example for her children by exposing them to such serious acts of violence and encouraging them to assist in torturing Andrew. With regards to Simon, Judge Fox said that he had acted, quote, "knowing full well what your sister was doing to this man. You repeatedly were the enforcer. stepping in cruelly when he sought to resist or avoid her attacks. Judge Fox reinforced the findings of the pathologist that Andrew Gardner died in agony due to the extensive injuries he had suffered from weeks of torture. He concluded by stating, quote, "In the weeks prior to his demise on Friday, March the 13th last year, he was cruelly tortured and subjected to an appalling catalogue of attacks, which not only caused him acute pain in so many ways at your hands, but also dreadful humiliation. In your sometimes different, but sometimes joint ways, you each contributed not only to the breaking of his body, but also his spirit. In his final days, that he must have spent prone or leaning against a wall, he was deprived of all human dignity." He then sentenced them. For the murder of Andrew Gardner, Claire Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Simon Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Stephen Martin's sentence was delayed for various reports to be written, and on the 13th of February 2010, he too was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years before he could apply for parole. All three subsequently appealed the length of their sentences, but all were rejected. This case just has layers of horror. This is again highlighted by how Ken and Jean Gardner found out about their son's death. They saw news about a man being found dead at a property in Chiltern, but had no idea that this was their son. As they did not know where he was living at the time, Claire made sure he was totally cut off from them, but then had to go through the horror of receiving a knock at the door and being told their son was not only dead, but had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks on Earth had been marked by horrific acts of torture. A victim impact statement read out in court written by Jean stated, quote, "To be told that Andrew was dead was horrible. I knew there was something wrong straight away. He was someone who would simply walk away from trouble. To listen to the details of how he died and the suffering he went through was beyond belief. The thoughts of what went on at the hands and direction of that evil woman has left me with nightmares that will probably never go away. Andrew was a pleasant, caring, loving lad who kept out of trouble and was never violent to anyone. It's hurt being here. It's hurt watching her give evidence, so much so I had to go out of the courtroom. I knew she was lying. It's unspeakable what she and the others did. You don't do that to another human being. They turned our family's lives upside down and left us empty shells. I called them evil to their faces in court, but it hurt even more to see their smug reaction. No matter how long they're behind bars, the hurt they cause will never go away. It will be with me and my family forever." To highlight the man that Andrew was, in contrast to the monsters who robbed him of his life, it's assumed the reason why Andrew stayed in the property was for one reason, and for one reason only: the daughter he had with Claire. He was described as a, quote, "doting father to his daughter." He loved her and wanted to be with her, and was not a man to abandon his responsibilities. His family believe, and I think this is true, that Andrew was unwilling to abandon his daughter, to leave her in the care of a woman as evil as Claire, and so he stayed, with him hoping, probably, that he could protect her from her sadistic mother. Unfortunately, this would cost him his life. It upsets me when people make comments saying, why did they not just leave, or why did they not see the red flags? I realise now I shouldn't be annoyed or upset. People don't necessarily understand domestic abuse and how insidious it is. Leaving is not that easy. Do you not think that someone whose whole purpose is to control their partner has not worked to cut every avenue of escape? When people say, why did she not leave him, or why did he not leave her, this suggests this person is the one making choices in a relationship, and this is missing the whole point. They've often been robbed of this choice, often because they're scared of what might happen to them, which is a well-founded concern, as in the UK, 2 women a week are murdered by their partners or former partners. So please, think what you write. Domestic abuse is much more complicated than you probably realise. I think this is important to point out because of Andrew. He was clearly isolated, alone with no money, and basically confined to the house. He had no means of escape. And this should be the focus. The fact that this poor man spent his final weeks being abused and tortured, and that he died alone, with this being the only escape from the horror he endured. I hope he's at peace. While 3 people were convicted of Andrew's murder, it's clear that Claire Nichols was the ringleader, so my focus will be on her. This woman is truly evil, a psychopathic sadist who clearly has no remorse or empathy or interest in anyone but herself. It's clear she's a woman who saw people in her life as a means to an end, things to be manipulated, used and abused. I don't have enough information about Claire's past to identify when or how she became this type of monster. But, like other people I've covered, like Catherine Knight, I think she despised men, saw them as beneath her, and therefore she was able to justify treating them in any way she wanted. She was also an utter coward, targeting the most vulnerable men she could find to do her bidding and to control, knowing that these individuals likely had significant difficulties in understanding the danger they were in and potentially did not have the ability to reach out for help or formulate a plan to escape. I have a particular disdain of people who target the vulnerable, for reasons that I'll probably get into at some point in the future. But basically, adults who I've met with learning disabilities have often been some of the purest, least pretentious people I've ever met. They're some of the most caring and kindest people. They see the world in such a different way, a way I would like to see it. It's a place of happiness and hope. So when these people are targeted, I feel truly sickened, as they often have no defense against the predators of this world, and their pure spirit and their personality, which more people should have, is destroyed. Andrew Garden was someone like this. Everything I've read about him says that he was a lovely man, someone who's honest, caring, trustworthy, and devoted to those he loved. He loved his daughter, and stayed and suffered the abuse, likely so that he could be near her, and tried to protect her. He wanted to bring happiness into the world, and he was targeted, abused, and murdered by a woman so weak that she needed to manipulate and control vulnerable men in her life in order to feel a sense of control. The part of this case which really, really gets to me, and which I think shows the utter depravity of Claire Nichols, is the issue of her children. As I already said earlier, she allowed them to be around a convicted paedophile, showing no regard for the potential harm this person could have caused them. But, worse still, she exposed them to horrific acts of violence towards Andrew, and even got them to be involved in his behaviour. None of these children were over the age of 10 years old, but her poisonous parenting meant that she made them believe that torturing someone was okay. However, I don't think she thought about this too much. She didn't give a shit about the lifelong trauma these children would have to deal with. Her only focus was on getting others to do her bidding. Also, Claire would have known as part of the trial prep that her 7-year-old son was going to be forced to testify, not only having to relive the horror that he'd seen in his home, but also having to admit that he had been involved in the abuse of Andrew. This would have no doubt re-traumatised his child, but Claire did not care. She was willing to throw anyone under the bus to save her own skin. As I've said repeatedly in my videos, the one constant is the link between childhood experiences and future criminal behaviour. In the case of Claire, all she taught her children was that violence and manipulation was acceptable, that people who you claim to love are allowed to be hurt, tortured, or even killed. I know it will never happen, but I really believe there should be some accountability for parents if their children go on to do horrific things and there is a link to what they're exposed to in the family home. Basically, if one of Claire's children becomes a domestic abuse perpetrator, etc., then I think she should be held accountable as well. I have no information about where her children ended up, but I pray they were taken away from the family altogether and placed with loving people who could try and undo some of the damage their demon of a mother caused. Not that Claire would ever admit any fault. She's a pathetic creature who, in my opinion, and this may be a little strong, should never have been a mother, and who should spend the rest of her life behind bars for the horrific torture and murder of Andrew. I'm not sure someone who does something like this, and whose personality is so clearly sadistic and psychopathic, can ever truly be considered to not be a risk to society. However, the question of whether she will be released or not is not something that will be addressed until approximately 2042, when she's able to apply for parole, when she's around the age of 60 years old. In 1981, Renee Hartevelt, the Dutch national, accepted a dinner invitation from a university classmate, Issy Sagawa. It would be a fatal mistake, as Sagawa had, by this point, decided he wanted to kill, have sex with, and eat Renee, in that order, and this is exactly what he did. However, as if this is not bad enough, Sagawa faced no punishment and became a minor celebrity in Japan, making money from what he had done, which he freely confessed to. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Issei Sagawa was born on the 26th of April 1949 in Kobe, Japan, to wealthy parents. Sagawa was born prematurely. Reportedly, he was small enough that he could fit in the palm of his father's hand, and whilst he survived, he had a number of health issues as a child and was extremely introverted. Sagawa apparently began to have fancies about cannibalism when he was only 5 or 6 years old, when he saw a male schoolmate's thigh which he wanted to eat. As he grew up, Sagawa became more socially isolated and disappeared into a world of sexual fantasy, including having sex with the corpses of women and eating them. As a youth, Sagawa also became interested in bestiality and began to engage in sexual acts with the family dog. Sagawa was a smart man and attended university in Japan, earning both a bachelor's and master's degree in literature, but his mask of sanity was beginning to slip. At age 24, Sagawa tried to act on his cannibalistic fantasies and broke into the home of a German woman, intending to kill her and eat her. When he broke in, she was asleep. He looked for something to knock her out or stab her with. Before Sagawa could do this, she woke up and overpowered him. Being only 4 foot 7 inches tall, this was easily done, as Sagawa fled. Sagawa was arrested for attempted rape, but money talks, and his father paid the victim and the charges disappeared. This experience did not deter Sagawa. Instead, he realized that he would need to refine his methods if he was going to achieve his ultimate goal of killing and eating a woman. In 1977, Sagawa relocated to Paris, France, to pursue his PhD. While there, he solicited prostitutes and brought them to his home with the intent to shoot and cannibalize them, but he said he was never able to pull the trigger. However, in 1981, Sagawa became obsessed with a classmate, Renee Hartevelt, a tall, beautiful Dutch woman whom he was instantly attracted to. According to Sagawa, Renee liked his obvious intelligence, and he wrote her letters and invited her to concerts and exhibits. He was small and walked with a limp, yet she often went with him and seemed to want to spend time with him. On June the 11th, 1981, Sagawa invited Renee to dinner at his apartment under the guise of translating poetry for a school assignment, which he would then record. By this point, he'd apparently already decided to eat her in order to, quote, absorb her energy. He hid a gun in the apartment before she arrived, and when Renee was there, he seized her on the floor, Japanese-style street tea. He poured some whiskey into her tea to make her more pliable. He then told Renee that he was in love with her and wanted to have sex with her. Renee turned him down and said she just wanted to be friends. She then sat at the table on the right of this picture and began to read poetry. Sagawa approached her from behind, aimed the rifle at the back of her head, and shot Renee dead. Sagawa apparently fainted when he saw the blood, and when he came to his senses, he decided to desecrate Renee's body. Sagawa first had sex with Renee's corpse and then tried to bite into her flesh with his teeth, but realized they were not sharp enough, so he went out and bought a butcher's knife and then began to dismember and eat Renee. Sagawa describes his offending in an interview years later, in which, in response to a question about whether he ate Renee's flesh raw, he stated, quote, "Mostly yes. At first I bit into her butt with the intention of munching right through, but it's impossible. Human skin is so thick, I ended up with a sore jaw, although I managed to leave some teeth marks. I ended up swallowing the clitoris and some pubes without chewing on it because she had her period then and the smell was just horrendous. But it was the first moment that I actually felt a sort of sexual pleasure in eating her, as if my inner body was on fire. Also, you know how beef or whale meat has a sort of beastly smell to it? Human meat is odorless. I actually believe that human meat is the tastiest of all meats. It doesn't have any of that gamey animal smell. When I ate some more a couple of days later, just before I got arrested, the meat had become sweeter and it tasted great. The meat on the soles of the feet smelled bad though, and didn't taste very nice. The neck was the best. The meat tastes more delicate as you move up the body, especially above the torso. Her tongue was delicious as well. I took it out of her mouth and chewed on it raw. Neither the neck nor the tongue has much meat on it though, so if you really want to feast, you should eat the thighs. Sagawa removed one of Renee's breasts, fried and tried to eat it. He also cut off and ate parts of her face, buttocks, feet, thighs and neck, either raw or cooked. Other parts of her he kept in the fridge for consuming later. He also apparently used one of her hands to masturbate himself and slept with what remained of her corpse. However, by day 2, the body had started to decompose, and Sagawa realized he had to get rid of Renee. What was left of her body he further dismembered, including chopping off her head, partly to obtain more flesh to store, but also to fit her remains in 2 suitcases which he had bought. Sagawa had decided to dump the suitcase in a lake in the Bois de Boulogne, a large park in Paris. However, when he got there, he had trouble locating the suitcase and was seen by witnesses, which meant that he fled and simply left the cases on the grass. The witnesses approached and saw a human hand protruding from one of the suitcases and called the police. When they opened the suitcases, they saw parts of a human body sticking out of some sheets used to wrap something bloody. This is a picture of one of the suitcases and its concealed contents. The suitcases contain Renee's dismembered body, cut into at least 6 pieces. Due to Sagawa's distinctive appearance, it did not take the police long to find him and arrest him, and in the 4 days between the dumping of the body and his apprehension, Sagawa continued to eat parts of Renee's body. When the police searched the property, they found his fridge filled with parts of her flesh, which he was intending to eat at a later date. As if the crime was not bad enough, what happened next is beyond belief. So Sagawa was taken into police custody, and his wealthy father again assisted him by hiring a top lawyer. Sagawa freely admitted his crimes and was sent to a mental hospital, where he was held for 2 years and deemed to be unfit to stand trial. Therefore, any charges was dropped, and the file apparently sealed. He was then returned to Japan and committed to a mental institution, where he was deemed sane, and because the charges had been dropped by the French authorities, he was able to simply check himself out, which he did on the 12th of August 1986, with him spending the rest of his life as a free man. Trust me, it gets worse. So instead of being shunned by society, Sagawa became a minor celebrity in Japan. He even became a food critic, and no, I'm not joking. Sagawa was only too happy to tell people about his crimes on television talk shows. He even agreed to appear in several Japanese pornographic films, and he wrote 4 novels. The one in which he described the details of his murder sold over 200,000 copies. This clip shows him talking about one of his books, published apparently by a peddler of Lolita manga porn. What's really messed up about this clip is that the cartoon head he is holding is clearly that of Renee. I've seen a picture of the severed head, which I would not advise, and he's clearly gone to great pains to make sure that her truly horrific facial expression. Sagawa also wrote a weekly column for a tabloid publication, edited an anthology of cannibal fantasies, and was featured on the cover of a Japanese gourmet magazine. Sagawa reveled in his crimes and showed no remorse. He once stated, quote, "The public has made me the godfather of cannibalism, and I'm happy about that." I mean, where do I start with this one? Firstly, poor woman. And no shit she was scared, you just told her you killed and cannibalized a woman and showed her pictures of her dismembered body. But on top of that, this demonstrates what an absolute monster Sagawa was. He's reveling in his crimes and clearly getting off on terrifying this woman. Also, the dick behind the camera, clearly setting this up to capture this woman's reaction, and this feeds into what I'm going to discuss in a bit about celebrity criminals. But seriously, what is wrong with people? Sagawa cited that his life was hard because of what he had done, mainly because he could not get a regular job, and as his fame waned, so did the money. He made some bizarre statements about how he wished to die, with him stating, quote, "I would like to invite any woman who wants to kill me to step forward. Beautiful women only. That would be the ideal way for me to die. Maybe they could shoot me up with morphine so that I don't feel any pain. Although I guess the pain is part of the pleasure. Dying instantly is boring, so I want to savour the process of being killed. An alternative would be to drown in female saliva. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be covered all over in women's spit? If I could die drowning in it, that would be my ultimate dream come true. I'm a cowardly man who killed another person, yet I can't face killing myself, so I guess dying at the hands of a woman would be my way to redemption." And that is the key word here, cowardly. This man would not end his own life but wanted someone else to do it, and in such a way that meant he could continue to live out his sick sexual fantasies. I think this is the reason why Sagawa never killed again, due to fear, as Japan has the death penalty, and he knew further offences would likely lead to him losing his worthless life. Fortunately, Issei Sagawa died on the 24th of November 2022, at age 73 at a hospital in Tokyo, due to complications of pneumonia. He had suffered years of ill health and his fame had essentially ended, leaving him destitute. I don't think I've come across a more disturbing case than this, not only in terms of the crime, but how Sagawa essentially got away with it. It's clear that he was a highly dangerous and remorseless sexual deviant, with the only saving graces being that he is now dead and he did not kill again. Rather than talking about the profile of Issei Sagawa specifically, I want to raise another part of this case which really angers me, and that's the fact that he became a celebrity due to his crimes. I cannot imagine what Renee's family must have felt, knowing not only their daughter had been butchered, but the man who did it was free and making money off what he did. This reminds me of scenes of the trials of Ted Bundy and Richard Ramirez, where women will flock to see them, as well as writing them sexually explicit letters. I also can't imagine what it must have been like for the families of the many, many victims of these men whose lives have been utterly destroyed, seeing a gaggle of women sat there, fluttering their eyelids at these ruthless killers whilst making kissy faces. It just beggars belief, given the fact that, if they could, both men would have probably raped and murdered these women. So there seem to be two parts to this behaviour. Firstly, there's actually a condition where people can have a sexual arousal to dangerous situations or dangerous people called hybriskophilia, so this seems to account for some of this attention. However, others have said it is part of our wider obsession with celebrities, with us being obsessed with the life of others and their fame, even if it's actually infamy. With killers, it may be that the joy is the fact these people have broken social norms and done something so horrific that our attention is drawn to them. A bit like when you see an accident on the motorway, you can't help but slow down and have a look. In the case of Sagawa, I think that making him a food critic was a way to shock people so they would buy more papers or magazines, and the dick that was filming the interaction between the porn star and Sagawa likely went bragging about the fact he had filmed the awful interaction between her and the Kobe cannibal. So it's a case of, yeah, so he killed an 80 woman, but he can make me rich and famous. Ultimately, the person who should be focused on and remembered in this case is Renee, a beautiful young woman whose life was ended horrifically by a pathetic excuse for a man who, if there's any justice, is suffering some torment somewhere from which he will get no rest and there will be no end. At 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018, the following call was made to 999.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No.
They're not breathing?
No.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3? Bear with
Yeah.
me. Okay. So she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged, okay?
The woman making this call, 21-year-old Louise Porton, had just murdered her 3-year-old daughter Lexi after 2 previous failed attempts, which left her fighting for her life. Porton smothered Lexi and waited hours to make sure she was dead before calling for an ambulance.
Just 18 days later, Porton made another phone call for help as her 17-month-old daughter Scarlett had stopped breathing. Paramedics found that this child too had been dead for some time before help was called, with Porton having smothered her hours before. Porton is an evil, self-obsessed woman, utterly without conscience and remorse, who, whilst Lexi was fighting for her life during an unsuccessful attempt to kill her, was in the hospital toilet, sending topless photos of herself to men, and, when this child died, she was heard laughing at the funeral home. She also begged men for money to drive Scarlett to the hospital, knowing she was already dead. Her crimes, callousness, and likely motivation for murdering her own children is truly sickening, and I have no doubt will appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Louise Porton was born in 1996 and raised in the market town of Walsall in the county of Warwickshire in the West Midlands of the UK. Despite apparently coming from a close family, Porton soon developed into a selfish, vindictive, violent and narcissistic child. Those close to Porton later testified in court that the family was close-knit, but she was always an outsider, and this was through choice. When the family would visit Porton's grandmother, Joy, she would sit with a scowl on her face in the corner, alone, whilst everyone else enjoyed their time together. If anyone sat near her, she would say, quote, "Go away or I'll smash your face." Porton would also be very vindictive. She would dig her nails into her cousin's skin when no one was looking, causing them to cry, and then she would deny all knowledge of this happening. She was reported to have never apologised for anything she did. When she was around 11 years old, Joy began noticing that every time that Porton would come round, items of money would go missing. It was clear that Porton was stealing from her grandmother. When challenged on this, Porton would use emotional manipulation to get her own way, telling her grandmother if she accused her of stealing, then she'd never come round again. So Joy would continue to let her come round, not wanting to lose connection with her family, and things would continue to go missing. From an early age, it was clear that Porter was obsessed with money and owning things. She was incredibly materialistic. Her abusive behaviour towards her family meant she was basically cut off from them, something she seemed to be indifferent about. The final straw came in 2016, when Porter was aged around 20, and when Joy became seriously ill and had to be admitted to hospital. It became clear quickly that she was not going to recover. One of her cousins later recalled, quote, "When Nan was in hospital, she was the only one who wouldn't come. I contacted Louise and told her they'd given Nan less than 24 hours, but she said, I can't make it. I told her it was the last chance. She said, I heard what you said, but I'm not coming. I just put the phone down. I was so emotional." After this point, the family cut her off. Porton herself appears to have been abandoned by her mother, Sharon Porton, which was around 11 years old, with her leaving the family home to begin another relationship, leaving their father to raise her and her 2 siblings. This understandably devastated Porton, as she didn't speak to her mother for a number of years, and this separation likely led to a deterioration of her own, already concerning behaviour, which was entirely self-centred, with her quickly defining herself by money she stole and items she bought with her ill-gotten gains. Porton did reconnect with her mother Sharon when she reached adulthood, but the damage was likely already done by this point. While still a teenager, Porton became extremely promiscuous. She's reported to have had sex with anyone who would show her attention. Porton quickly realised that she could use this behaviour to make money for herself, and so would specifically seek out men with means, who, in exchange for sex, would give her cash or buy designer clothes or shoes or handbags, etc. By the age of 18 years old, she was signed up with various dating sites offering sexual services for money, and she would regularly go on Facebook to brag about how much money she was making from sex work, showing defiance of anyone who would call her out for her behaviour, claiming they were just jealous of how easily she could make money. Porton had, it would appear, some relationships that didn't revolve around payment. This included one with a man called Chris Draper. However, Porton was abusive within the relationship, deliberately bragging to Chris about the men she was sleeping with and the amount of money she was making. She seemed to get off on making others feel small. This union, such as it was, produced 2 beautiful children, both girls, Lexi Draper, who was born in 2014, and Scarlett Vaughan, who entered the world in 2016. Chris was estranged from his daughters at the time of their deaths in 2018. This was apparently due to Porton, as, in an act of complete malice, when she was pregnant with Scarlett, she moved to Rugby, a town 40 miles away, and forbid Chris from seeing Lexi. He was not there at the birth of Scarlett, and was forbidden from seeing her. He could only see pictures of her online. Tragically, he never met her before she died. Porter would emotionally abuse Chris online, claiming that neither child was his. However, Porton didn't care about the children. They were merely props, a thing to use to get what she wanted. She took them away from Chris to hurt him. This was all about what she wanted. This is shown in her caring for the children, and I use that term loosely. Porton would spend hours on internet dating sites, including Meet Me and Badoo, offering her services for as little as £30 while she was meant to be looking after the children. And messages recovered after her arrest show that she was bringing men back to the property where she lived. Her and her children shared a bedroom, but this didn't stop her. She messaged one client saying they could still have sex in the room as long as they were quiet so as not to wake the children. On another occasion, Porton went outside to have sex with a man in a van while the children were sleeping. She was also on various websites referring to herself as a, quote, model, including appearing under the name Lollipop on the website Purple Port. In court, her landlady, Leanne Bradley, said it was, quote, rare for Porton to look after the children, and she would often be asked to look after them when she was out to meet men. It got to the point where they were spending more time being looked after by Leanne than by their mother. When she was around, Porton was abusive to the children, and Leanne recalled in court, quote, they would cry and not always do what she asked them to do. She would tell them to shut the fuck up, or she would give them something to cry for. Porton would also sometimes leave the children with her mother, Sharon Porton. It seemed that she would only reach out to family when she wanted something. At their post-mortem, the children were found to have injuries to their bodies, suggesting that Porton had beaten them before their deaths. Porton would moan to everyone that she was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet and living in poverty. However, she was obsessed with posting pictures of her lifestyle, including shocking trips and various outfits she was buying. Clearly, every penny that she got was used on herself. She had long-term arrangements with some of the men she had sex with, and when she would snap her fingers, they would send money to her account to fund her shopping trips or pay for her petrol, etc. One of the measures recovered after her arrest showed her asking for money for pictures, with her saying, quote, "Tell me how much you put in and I will do pictures. If you put in enough, we can meet up and I will fuck you." Before discussing the horrific sequence of events that came next, I want to point out a few things. First and foremost is the extreme narcissism of Louise Porton. I've rarely seen a case with someone so fixated on themselves with no consideration for anyone else. Even people I've met who have been deeply self-centered have a small glimmer of consideration for other people. If a family member was dying, even they would know that they should be there in person. However, if something didn't benefit Porton, then she wasn't interested. Her grandmother, a woman who had apparently been a consistent part of her life, was dying. But who cares? Can't be bothered. All Porton was interested in was money. Secondly is her utter vindictiveness, bordering, in my opinion, on sadism. She was, from a young age, someone who enjoyed causing harm to others, seeing them in distress. Later, she deliberately stopped a man from seeing his own children, purely, I think, to cause him pain. She even claimed that he wasn't the father, an act of pure spite. Likely, this also explains the reason she didn't see her grandmother before she died. She wanted her to be upset that family member didn't come to see her. Porton wanted her to suffer. Lastly, is Porton's complete lack of remorse at any stage of her life. She didn't feel bad about harming her cousins as a child, or stealing from her grandmother. She didn't feel anything when she died, and thought nothing of ripping a man away from his children, or depriving them of a father. It was widely reported later that Porton killed her children as they got in the way of her sex life. This seems to have stuck, as is the angle the prosecution played. But, as I come back to later, this was not accepted by the judge, and it's not actually what the evidence shows. The reason why Porton did what she did, in my opinion, was far, far more complex and much more sinister. And I'll highlight this as we go along, and I'm confident that, by the end, you'll agree this woman is pure evil. By January 2018, Louise Porton had decided to kill her children. She began with 3-year-old Lexi. Before finally ending her life, Porton tried to kill her on at least 2 occasions. On the 2nd of January 2018, a call was made to 999 by Porton, saying that Lexi was experiencing breathing difficulties. Paramedics rushed to the property and found Lexi unconscious. She was soon revived and taken to hospital, arriving there at around 1 a.m. Text messages show that during the ride to the hospital and whilst her daughter was being treated, Porton was sending messages to someone about a, quote, happy ending, and at 1:18 a.m. she was arranging a meeting with a man and telling him he needs to pay cash up front. At around 6 a.m, Lexi was discharged from hospital. In the early hours of the 4th of January 2018, another call was made to 999 by Porton, who said that Lexi was again struggling to breathe. Paramedics rushed to the property again and found Lexi unconscious, lying on her back on the floor. A paramedic who attended said in court that her condition was critical, that Lexi was suffering from severe breathing difficulties. She was stabilised at the scene and rushed to the hospital. Without this intervention, Lexi would have died. The paramedic said that Porton was, quote, not distressed at all in the back of the ambulance, and he stated he believed that she was drinking wine from a glass when he first attended. Whilst Lexi was fighting for her life in hospital, Porton was in the toilet, taking selfies of her breasts to send to people she was arranging to meet for sex. She acted the concerned mother to various men she messaged, and to at least one, she said, quote, really need funds to help me get by. And this, here, is in my opinion the primary motivation for why Porton did what she did. Money. As it will be shown moving forward, anytime she could use a tragedy to turn a profit, she would. Tragically, it wouldn't be determined until after her death that Lexi had been strangled by Porton resulting in her almost dying on 2 occasions. It seems that Lexi was only in hospital until late on the 4th of January or the 5th of January 2018, and during this time, Porton was making various searches, including, quote, "Can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? And how long after drowning could someone be resuscitated?" She was also reading articles about children who'd been brought back to life after drowning. On the 6th of January 2018, rather than looking after her daughter, who had just come out of hospital, Porton was offering her sexual services to a man for the entire day for £300. Louise Porton decided to finally kill Lexi on the 14th of January 2018, and, the day before, made further harrowing online searches, including, quote, "How long does it take for a dead body to go cold up to the shoulder?" She also sent a message to a man saying that a doctor had said that Lexi had flu and would soon pass away. This was clearly a lie. This harrowing CCTV footage shows Lexi entering the family home for the last time, being followed by her sister. Just a few hours later, Porton would suffocate Lexi by placing either a hand or some other object over her nose and mouth. Porton then waited hours to make sure Lexi was dead and there was no chance of her being revived. Only then did she make the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, which was made at 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018. Paramedics again returned to the same address they'd been to twice before in the last 2 weeks, but this time there was no saving Lexi. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics were concerned, as Lexi had clearly been dead for hours, and they were not convinced by Porton's claims that she'd found her daughter lifeless in bed and called an ambulance straight away. Again, Porton showed no emotion and didn't shed a tear at the death of her daughter. The next day, Porton was back online arranging sex with men. On screen are conversations recovered from this day, the 16th of January 2018, and as you can see, she describes herself as a model, but says she's taking a break because, quote, "My little girl passed away yesterday." However, within an hour and a half, Porton is talking to another man called Leon, arranging a, quote, "date." Porton couldn't even pretend to care, and a few days later was seen laughing at her funeral directors and yawning when discussing the arrangements for Lexi. She also sent a message to a friend, making a joke that she'd gone from 2 children to just 1. On January the 19th, 2018, post-mortem examination was conducted on Lexi, but a cause of death couldn't be determined. It was concluded that death wasn't natural and was unexplained, but at the time, not suspicious. Various samples were sent away for analysis. Unfortunately, the results of these tests would not be returned in time, as, just 18 days later, Louise Porton killed for the second time. This time, she ended the life of her 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett. On the 1st of February 2018, Louise Porton and Scarlett were staying in a hotel, I believe due to some issue with their own property. CCTV footage from 6:55 PM shows Porton carrying Scarlett up to the hotel room, where, likely within minutes, she was suffocated by her own mother, in the same way Lexi had been murdered. There's no doubt that, by around 7:30 PM, Scarlett was dead. Porton again sat with her daughter's body to make sure she was dead. She didn't call for help. Her utter callousness was shown by messages sent during this time. As shown on screen, note that she describes Scarlett as being, quote, "not well," and at 9:22 PM, she begins messaging a guy saying, quote, "Any chance of putting 30 in my bank now for fuels to get my daughter Scarlett to the hospital? I'll transfer it back Wednesday." So, with her daughter already dead, Porton is trying to get money. I have no words for this woman, I really don't. Finally, confident that her daughter was dead, at around 10 PM, Porton strapped Scarlett in a car seat and was seen driving. 15 minutes later, she stops at a petrol station to fill up her vehicle, apparently without a care in the world. At this point, she's standing mere feet away from her dead daughter, who is strapped into the car seat. You would think that Porton was driving to the hospital. No, soon after filling up her car, she pulled over and dialed 111, the non-emergency medical advice line in the UK, and said that Scarlett became unwell when they were driving, and then she stopped breathing. Porton then returned to the hotel, unstrapped her daughter from the car seat, and returned her to the room where she'd been murdered. Paramedics arrived at around 11 p.m. It was clear there was nothing that could be done for Scarlett. She was freezing cold, and her body was stiff, indicating that she'd been dead for hours. So, by the age of just 21, and within the space of 18 days, Louise Porton had murdered her 2 children. The deaths of 2 children, with no significant medical history, just 18 days apart, obviously raised alarm bells. And, on the 2nd of February 2018, a post-mortem was conducted on Scarlett, and a further one completed on Lexi. Various tests were completed, and samples taken, and Warwickshire police were notified, and a murder investigation was started. Unfortunately, a case like this takes time to compile, and Porton will remain at liberty for almost a year before justice finally caught up with her. In the immediate aftermath, Porton showed absolutely no emotion in the days after losing her 2nd child. She was described as going to an appointment with a housing officer on the 5th of February 2018 and being completely calm and emotionless. On March the 20th, 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering Lexi and Scarlett and released under investigation. It's clear the police didn't have enough evidence to charge her, but I always think this is a shot across the bow, letting the perp know it's only a matter of time, hoping they'll crumble or make a mistake. However, Porton was unfazed, and sickeningly, in June 2018, she posted an ad on Facebook selling her dead children's clothes. I mean, look at this image. The clothes of her dead children have basically been stuffed into a bin bag and are also strewn all over the floor. I've no doubt this is a reflection of how she saw her own children and how she treated them. Porton carried on doing what she would do for years, arranging sex with men online, claiming to be a model, but also using the death of her own children to make a profit, including selling their clothes. On the 24th of November 2018, she uploaded this disgusting post as a tribute to the children she'd murdered, which reads, quote, "Mummy's angels, take from me too soon. You'll never be forgotten. R.I.P." However, whilst the police were slowly working behind the scenes to build a case, Porton had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. She was subjected to constant trolling, and her response was to post things like, quote, "Fuck the haters." Initially in Porton's corner was her mother Sharon, who I think just didn't want to believe her daughter was capable of these things. But in March 2018, Sharon posted a message on Facebook saying that her daughter had punched her to the floor. Finally, in January 2019, enough evidence had been gathered to prove not only that Lexi and Scarlett had been suffocated to death by Porton, but she'd also tried to kill Lexi on 2 previous occasions. In addition, all of Porton's social media posts and messages had been catalogued, and on January the 25th, 2019, Louise Porton was rearrested and charged with the murders of 3-year-old Lexi Draper and 17-month-old Scarlett Vaughan, and she was remanded into custody to await her day in court. To no one's surprise, Louise Porton pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her trial started on the 3rd of July 2019 at Birmingham Crown Court. As I said at the beginning of the video, the prosecution framed this as Porton killing her children because they got in the way of her sex life. But over the 28-day trial, this wasn't the picture that was outlined. Although this claim stuck, it was shown that Porton carried on her sex life, regardless of whether the children were there or not. There was no real change in her activity before the children were born or after they died. Porton gave evidence, but simply denied any wrongdoing, stating that she loved her children and had no reason to kill them, but her cold demeanour didn't help her case. On the 31st of July 2019, the jury went out to deliberate and returned within 24 hours to deliver unanimous guilty verdicts to the charges of murdering Lexi and Scarlett. The next day, the 2nd of August 2019, Porton stood before Mrs. Justice Yip for sentencing. She described Porton's actions as both, quote, evil and calculated. She stated, quote, "These were blameless young children who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away. She said there were no obvious signs of Porton suffering from any mental illness, but that, quote, "It's plainly part of your makeup that you find it difficult to make and sustain emotional attachments and to put the needs of others ahead of your own." She then sentenced her. For the murders of Lexi Draper and Scarlett Vaughan, Louise Porton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Porton showed no emotion during her sentencing. Aside from her current prison being publicised, H&P Foston Hall, a women's closed prison in the village of Foston in Derbyshire, little has been reported about Porton's time inside. I imagine she won't have an easy time of it. I'll have to grow up quickly in this environment. Lexi and Scarlett were finally laid to rest, together, on the 3rd of September 2019, with their tiny coffins being carried in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, taking them on their final journey. Their funeral was organised by their father, Chris Draper, who said that he wanted to give them, quote, "the send-off you deserved." I cannot imagine the pain this man endured, bearing both his children, including one he'd never met. In a victim impact statement in court, Chris spoke about things suicidal after the death of his children. He said, quote, "I am broken. I keep asking myself, why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters?" He continued, quote, "No punishment will ever be enough, as I'll never get my daughters back." After the funeral, he wrote on Facebook, quote, "Gave you the send-off you deserved. All eyes on you, and you'll be missed, but never forgotten. Sleep tight, babies. Daddy's got you. Daddy will always have your back. Sleep tight. Love, your daddy." I hope with all sincerity that Lexi and Scarlett are safe, loved, and together for the rest of eternity. Rest in peace, little angels. The death of the children also devastated their grandmother, Sharon Porter, and, in a terrible postscript, she committed suicide on the 2nd of September 2020. Friends said she struggled to cope with the grief of losing her grandchildren and the guilt that she raised a monster and had not stopped her. It also appears that she was receiving a lot of abuse for the actions of her daughter. So, Louise Porton's behaviour, her evil, claimed the lives of, in my opinion, 3 people, and irreparably destroyed the lives of many, many more. As I said, despite the prosecution claiming that Porton killed her children to continue sex working, the more I look into this case, the less I agree with this statement. Even if this was part of the rationale, I think it's a minor part, that she was happily going along, doing whatever she was doing, and simply palming the children off on others. Instead, I think the Porton's motivation was, at a very basic level, financial. She killed her children because of money, but it's much more complicated than that. Let's start from the beginning. There's not much about Porton's early life, but it's clear that something was seriously wrong with her from a young age. Whether she was born this way or developed into this is unclear, but it's apparent that she was extremely antisocial and enjoyed hurting people. Underneath her behaviour, I think, was insecurity and extremely low self-esteem, with her using violence to make herself feel better about herself. Quickly, money became a way for her to feel good about herself. Money meant she could buy things, designer clothes, handbags, etc., to portray herself as successful, powerful, in order to hide from the damaged person she was. She began sleeping with anyone and everyone, and this is commonly an indicator of underlying issues with self-esteem, with people looking for validation, even briefly through sex, feeling wanted for that brief period of time, before having to confront how they actually feel about themselves. In order to avoid this, they keep having sex again and again and again, to avoid confronting their underlying issues. Porton realised she could combine the two things. Men would pay her for sex. Win-win. She'd get the validation she wanted, whilst also making money, which she could use to fund her lifestyle. I think getting money to maintain this was her sole purpose in life. She needed money in order to keep the shaky foundations of her pretend life from collapsing. She couldn't stand to acknowledge the person she actually was, or let the world see a glimpse of the damaged little girl she was. She was also horrendously spiteful. Any opportunity she could to hurt someone, she would take. And, by harming them, she felt powerful, reveling in other people's misery. Again, I'm sure this was a way for her to offset her own feelings of inadequacy. And this last reason is why she took her 2 children away from their father. Out of spite, she wanted him to suffer by not being able to see the children. They were simply pawns to be used. I think she thought little more than achieving this objective. She didn't think, how am I going to raise these children? I think when this dawned on her, she realised she was completely incapable. In court, Paulson admitted that she found parenting difficult. I think this was because she'd spent so many years being utterly self-absorbed that she had no ability to care for anyone but herself. If she was struggling, she could have contacted social services, or asked for help, or returned them to their father, or any number of things. But of course she didn't. That would make her look bad. Forget the fact she would have the children, it'd mean that she'd have to admit fault. Her carefully crafted image would come crumbling down. So I firmly believe she resented the children, despite her putting them in that situation. They were at fault. They didn't benefit her in any way, and likely, she saw them as a drain on her resources. She was having to spend money on them and devote time to raising them, which took focus away from the most important thing in the world to her, herself. I think Paulson then realised that with these objects, because that's how she saw them, out of the way, there'd be more money for her, and sickeningly, I've no doubt that she was going to use the death of her children to rinse people for everything they were worth. We saw examples of this, saying she was struggling to cope when Lexi was in hospital, and needing money for petrol when taking Scarlett to hospital, and selling the children's clothes mere months after their death. The children's bodies were not released for burial until after Paulson's arrest in 2019, but I've absolutely no doubt whatsoever that she'd been in charge of their funerals. She would have set up as many fundraising pages as she could and begged for money from everywhere. She would have then paid for the cheapest funeral possible whilst pocketing the rest of the money, which she could then spend to keep on living the life which enabled her to avoid actually looking into the deep, dark hole of nothingness inside of her. I think she only didn't do this because she knew the police were circling, and I have no doubt that, as part of her sex work, the issue of how she was struggling to deal with the death of her 2 children and how desperate she was for money must have come up. This profile, I think, is more accurate. I would suggest that Louise Porton is what is known as a malignant narcissist, which is a severe condition which combines the traits of several different personality disorders, including narcissism, antisocial behaviour, aggression, and sadism, meaning essentially this type of individual will abuse others without remorse and often take great pleasure in this behaviour in order to get their own way. In the case of Louise Porton, she was willing to smother her own children, something that would have taken minutes, just so that she could maintain her lifestyle and continue to avoid the terror of admitting who she really was to herself and others. Saying that she did these things as the children got in the way of her sex life is a dangerous oversimplification. Louise Porton is a woman who will target, victimise, and kill anyone in order to get her own way. The chances of her being treated are, in my opinion, incredibly low. So, when she's released, I think she'll pose a serious danger to anyone who gets close to her. If she felt in the future that killing a child would help her make gain for herself, she would, without hesitation. But I think by the time she's released, which will be when she's in her 50s at the earliest, she will potentially change her MO. I can imagine her slithering herself into the lives of wealthy men and finding some way to take everything from them, potentially, if it benefited her, their lives. In this respect, I think that Louise Porton is an extremely dangerous predator who, in my humble opinion, isn't likely to ever be safe to be released. I just wanted to say something about this case. I read somewhere that concerns were raised to social services about Porton's parenting before the murders, but I have literally no information about what their involvement was, or the lack thereof. I'd be shocked, given her behaviour, that she didn't flag up on someone's radar. This is the sort of case I would expect to have been reviewed at a national level, and I'll keep an eye out in case there is a report. If I find out any more details, I'll do an update on this case. Anyway,